Chapter 21 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kieran Metz. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 21. In which Pliny surprises everyone. Everybody stared, and this had the effect of making the dear good creature blush to the eyes. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," said Mr. Jack Rogers. It was not for me to say so, perhaps." Her voice quavered a little, and now a pair of bright tears trembled on her lashes. But she kept up her chin bravely, and seemed to take courage as she went on. "I am aware, sir, that in all matters of hazard and enterprise it is for the gentleman to take the lead. If I appear forward, if I speak too impulsively, my affection for Harry must be my excuse." Mr. Rogers stared at Captain Branscome, and from Captain Branscome to Mr. Goodfellow, but their faces did not help him. "That's all very well, ma'am, but an expedition to the other end of the world, if that's what you suggest, at a moment's notice, on what, as like or not, may turn out to be a wild goose chase? Lord bless my soul!" wound up Mr. Rogers incoherently, falling back in his chair. "I was not proposing to start at a moment's notice," replied Pliny, with extreme simplicity. "There will, of course, be many details to arrange, and I do not forget that we are in the house of mourning. The poor dear Major claims our first thoughts, naturally. Yes, there must be 101 details to be discussed hereafter, at a fitting time. And it may be many weeks before we find ourselves actually launched, if I may use the expression, upon the bosom of the deep." "We?" gasped Mr. Rogers, and again gazed around. But we others had no attention to spare for him. "We? Who are we?" "Why, all of us, sir, if I might dare to propose it, or at least as many as possible of us whom the hand of Providence has so mysteriously brought together. I will confess that while you were talking just now, discussing this secret which, properly speaking, belongs to Harry alone, I doubted the prudence of it." "And by jingo, you were right," put in Miss Belcher. "With your leave, ma'am," Pliny went on, "I have come to think otherwise. To begin with, but for Captain Branscome, the map would never have found its way to the Major's room where Harry discovered it, but might, nay, probably would, have been stolen by the wicked man who committed this crime to get possession of it. Again, but for Mr. Goodfellow, this written narrative would undoubtedly have been lost to us, and the map, if not meaningless, might have seemed a clue not worth the risk of following. In short, ma'am," Pliny turned again to Miss Belcher, "I saw that each of us at this table had been wonderfully brought here by the hand of Providence, and from this I went on to see, and with wonder and thankfulness, that here was a secret sought after by many evildoers, which had yet come into the keeping of 6 persons, all of them honest, and wishful only to do good. Consider, ma'am, how unlikely this was, after the many bold, bad hands that have reached out for it. And will you tell me that here is accident only, and not the finger of Providence itself? At first, indeed, we suspected Captain Branscome and Mr. Goodfellow. They were strangers to us, and, as if that we might be tested, they came to us under suspicion." Here Mr. Goodfellow put up a hand and dubiously felt his nose, which was yet swollen somewhat from his first encounter with Mr. Rogers. "But they have proved their innocence. Harry gives me his word for them, and I do not think," said Pliny, "that you, ma'am, can have heard Captain Branscome's story without honoring him." Miss Belcher, thus appealed to, answered only with a grunt, at the same time shooting from under her shaggy eyebrows an amused glance at the captain, who stared at the tablecloth to hide his confusion, which, however, was betrayed by a pair of very red ears. "All this," pursued Pliny, "I saw by degrees, and that it was marvellous, but next came something more marvellous still, for I saw that if one had gone forth to choose 6 persons to carry out this business, he could not have chosen 6 better fitted for it." From the effect of this astounding proposition, Miss Lydia Belcher was the first to recover herself. "Thank you, my dear," she murmured, on behalf of myself and the company, as they say. It is true that in all these years I have overlooked my qualifications for a buccaneering job, but I'll think them out as you proceed." "Oh," exclaimed Pliny, "I wasn't counting on you, ma'am, to accompany this expedition, nor on Mr. Rogers. You are great folks as compared with us, and have public duties, a stake in the country, great wealth to administer. Yet I was thinking that, while we are abroad, there may happen to be business at home requiring attention, and that we may perhaps rely on you, who have shown so much interest in this sad affair." "Meaning that we have been dipping our fingers pretty deep into this pie?" "Well, and so we have, and thank you again, my dear, for putting it so delicately." "But I meant nothing of the sort. Indeed I didn't," protested Pliny. "Tut, tut, of course you didn't, but it's the truth nevertheless. Well, then, it appears that Jack Rogers and I are to be the spotsmen for this little expedition, and that you and Captain Branscome and Mr. Goodfellow, and yes, and Harry too, I suppose, are to be the Red Rovers and scour the Spanish Main. All right, only you don't look it exactly." Footnote: Miss Belcher was here employing a smuggling term. A spotsman is the agent who arranges for a run of goods and directs the operation from the shore, without necessarily taking a part in it. End footnote. "But is not that half the battle?" urged the indomitable Pliny. "They'll be so much the less likely to suspect us." "They, whoever they may be, will certainly be so far deluded. And really, if you will consider it, ma'am, what I am proposing is not ridiculous at all. For what is chiefly wanted for such an adventure? In the first place, a ship, and thank God I have the means to hire one. In the second place, a trustworthy navigator, and here, by the most unexpected good fortune, we have Captain Branscome. In the third place, a carpenter, to provide us with shelter on the island, and be at hand in case of accident to the vessel. And here is Mr. Goodfellow. While as for Harry—" Pliny hesitated, for the moment at a loss. Then her face brightened suddenly. "Harry can climb a tree, and the instructions on the back of the map point to this as necessary. Harry will be invaluable." I could have wrung her hand, but Pliny, having finished her justification of the ways of Providence, had taken off her spectacles and was breathing on them and polishing them with a small silk handkerchief which she ever kept handy for that purpose. "Captain Branscome," said Miss Belcher sharply, "will you be so good as to give us your opinion?" Captain Branscome lifted his head. "My mind, if you'll excuse me, ma'am, works a bit slowly, and always did. But there's no denying that Miss Plinlimmon has given the sense of it." "Hey?" "To be sure," said the captain, tracing with his finger an imaginary pattern on the tablecloth. "Her courage carries her too far, as in this talk about hiring a ship. A ship needs a crew. A crew that could be trusted on a treasure hunt is perhaps the most difficult to find in the whole world. And when you've found one to rely upon, your troubles are only just beginning. The main trouble is with the ship, and that's what no landsman can ever understand. A ship's the most public thing under heaven. You think of her maybe as something that puts out over the horizon and is lost to sight for months. But that helps nothing. She must clear from a port, and to a port sooner or later she must return. And in both ports 100 curious people at least must know all about her business. I don't say that a ship once out of sight cannot be made away with, though even that, with a crew to tell tales, has beaten some of the cleverest heads. But to take out a ship and fill her up with treasure and bring her home and unload her without anyone's knowing, that's a feat that, if you'll excuse me, I've heard 100 liars discuss at one time and another, and one has said it can be done in this way and another in that, but never a one in my hearing has found a way that would deceive a child." "Yet you said a moment since that Miss Plinlimmon had given the sense of it." "I did, ma'am. I am saying that to fetch this treasure will be difficult, even if we find it." "You don't doubt its existence?" "I do not, ma'am. I doubt it so little, ma'am, that I would 10 times sooner engage to find than to fetch it. But I don't even despair of fetching it if the lady goes on being as clever as she has begun." What? Exclaimed Pliny. I? Clever? Yes, indeed, ma'am, Captain Branscome answered, still in a slow, measured voice. But indeed, too, I might have been prepared for it when you started by taking a line that beats all my experience of landsmen. Or perhaps in this case I ought to say landsladies. Why, what have I done that is wonderful? You took the line, ma'am, that from here to Honduras, what is it but a passage? A few months at the most. Oh, to be sure, to a seaman that's no more than nature. But to hear it from anyone land-bred, and a lady, too. As a Christian man I have believed in miracles, but today I seem to be moving among them. And after your saying that, I had no call to be surprised when you up and suggested a way that would have taken a seaman 20 years to hit upon. I am not talking about the ship, ma'am. That part of your plan, if you'll allow me as a seaman to give an opinion, won't work at all. But the plan in general is a masterpiece. But I do not see, Pliny confessed with a small puckering of the brows, that I have suggested anything that can be called a plan. Why, ma'am, you have been talking heavenliest common sense, and once you've started us upon common sense, there's no such thing as difficulty. Let us go to the island, you said, and with that, at a stroke, you get rid of the worst danger we have to fear, which is suspicion. For who's to suspect such a company as this present, or any part of it, of being after treasure? Let us make it a pleasure trip, said you, or words to that effect. And what follows but that the whole journey is made cheap and simple? We book our passages in the Kingston packet. Peace has been declared with France, and what more natural than that a party of English should be traveling to see the West Indies? Or what more likely than that, after what has happened, the doctor has advised a sea voyage to soothe your mind? As for me, I am Harry's tutor, everyone in Falmouth knows it, and thinks me lucky to get the billet. It won't take 5 minutes to explain Mr. Goodfellow here just as easily. And as for me, struck in Miss Belcher, I'm an old madwoman, with more money than I know what to do with. And as for Jack Rogers, I'm eloping with him to a coral island. Mr. Rogers checked himself on the edge of a guffaw. But I say, Lydia, you're not serious about this, he asked. I don't know, Jack. I rather think I am. I'm getting an old woman, mad or not, and the hours drag with me sometimes up at the house. But, and here she looked up with one of those rare smiles that set you thinking she must have been pretty in her time, there's this advantage in having followed my own will for 50 years, that no one any longer troubles to be surprised at anything I may do. You're something of an eccentric yourself, Jack. You had better join the picnic. I ought to warn you, ma'am, said Captain Branscome gravely, that although the West India route has been fairly well protected for some months now, there is a certain amount of risk from American privateers. The Americans are a chivalrous nation, I have always heard. Extremely so, ma'am. Nevertheless, there is a risk in the event of the packet being attacked. But I was about to say, pursued Captain Branscome, that our being at war with America may actually help us to get across from Jamaica to the island. Quite a number of old colonial families, loyalists as we should call them, have been driven from time to cross over from the Main and settle in the West Indies. But of course they have left kinsfolk behind them in the States. And in spite of wars and divisions, it is no unusual thing for relatives to slip back and forth and visit one another, secretly, you understand. I have even heard of an old lady, now or until lately residing in St. Kitts, who has made no less than 11 such voyages to the Delaware, whenever, in short, her daughter was expecting an addition to her family. Good, said Miss Belcher. I have found someone to impersonate, and that settles it. I really think, ma'am, said Captain Branscome, that once in Jamaica we shall have no difficulty in finding, at the western end of the island, just the ship we require. Bless my soul, said Miss Belcher. Except for the sea voyage, it might be a middle-aged jaunt in a post-chaise. End of Chapter 21. Recording by Kieran Metz.
Chapter 22 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Logan Lorenz. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 22. A Strange Man in the Garden. Indeed, the longer we weighed the pros and cons, the more feasible appeared this simple adventure. We ran, to be sure, the risk of being waylaid on our passage by an American privateer. But this was a danger incident to all who sailed on board His Majesty's Post Office packets in the year 1814. That anything was to be feared from the man Glass, none of us, I believe, stopped to consider. We thought of him only as a foiled criminal, a fugitive from justice, and speculated only on the chance that, with the hue and cry out and the whole countryside placarded, the Plymouth runners would lay him by the heels. Undoubtedly he had made for Plymouth. From Torpoint came news that a man answering to his description had crossed the ferry there on the morning after the murder. The regular ferryman there had stepped into a public house for his regular morning glass of rum and water, and in his absence the small boy who acted as substitute had taken a stranger across. The stranger, who appeared to be in a sweating hurry, had rewarded the boy with half-a-crown, and the boy, rowing back to the Torpoint side and finding his master still in the tavern, had kept his own counsel, and the money. Now the hue and cry had frightened him into confessing, and his description left no doubt that the impatient passenger was Aaron Glass. Such a man had been observed about 2 hours later, mingling in the fish auction on the Barbican, and had actually bidden for a boatload of mackerel, but without purchasing. From the auction he had walked away in the direction of Southside Street, and from that point all trace of him was lost. Mr. Rogers, who had posted straight to Plymouth from the inquest, spent a couple of days in pushing inquiries here, there, and everywhere, but not even the promise of a clue rewarded him. 2 foreign-going vessels and 4 coasters had sailed from the port on the morning after the murder. The coasters were duly met, boarded, and searched at their ports of arrival, 2 at Liverpool, 1 at Milford, and 1 at Gravesend, but without result. If, as seemed likely, the man had contrived to ship himself on board the Hussar brig, bound for Barcelona, or the Mary Harvey bark for Rio, the chances of bringing him to justice might be considered nil, or almost nil, for Mr. Rogers had some hope of the Hussar being overtaken and spoken by a frigate, which happened to be starting 2 days later to join our fleet in the Mediterranean. During the week or 2 that followed my father's funeral, little was said of our expedition, although I understood from Pliny that the start would only be delayed until she and the lawyers had proved the will and put aside the estate in order for me. My father's pension had, of course, perished with him, but he left me a small sum in the funds, bearing interest between £50 and £60 per annum, together with the freehold of Minden Cottage. Unfortunately, he had appointed no trustees, and I was a minor, and, even more unfortunately, his will directed that Minden Cottage should be sold within a reasonably brief time after his death, and that the sum accruing should be invested in government stock for my benefit. And with this little tangle to work upon, our lawyers, Messrs. Harding and Whiteway of Plymouth, and the Court of Chancery, soon involved the small estate in complications which, as Miss Belcher put it, were the more annoying because the fools at both ends were honest men and trying to do the best for me. Of this business I understood nothing at the time, save that it caused delay, and I mention it here only to explain the delay, and because, as will be seen, the sale of Minden Cottage, when at length the Lord Chancellor was good enough to authorize it, had a very important bearing on the rest of my story. Meanwhile, Captain Branscombe had, of course, returned to Falmouth, and would book our passages on the Kingston packet as soon as my affairs allowed. We received letters from him from time to time, and on Saturdays and Mondays a passing call from Mr. Goodfellow on his way to and from Plymouth. He had stipulated that, before sailing with us, he should take his inamorata into his confidence, and this was conceded after Miss Belcher had taken the opportunity of a day's marketing in Plymouth to call at the dairy shop in Treville Street and make the lady's acquaintance. A very sensible young person, she reported, and of the 2 I'd sooner trust her than Goodfellow to keep a still tongue. There's no danger in that quarter. Nor was there, as it proved. Mr. Goodfellow told us that he could hardly contain himself whenever he thought of his prospects. "For," said he, "I was born a parish apprentice, in place of which here I be at the age of 20, with 2 fortunes waiting for me, one at each end of the world." At length, In the last week of July, Messrs. Harding and Whiteway announced that all formalities were complete, and 3 days later a bill appeared on the whitewashed front of Minden Cottage, announcing that this desirable freehold residence with 2½ acres of land would be sold by public auction on August 6th at 1:30 o'clock p.m. in the Royal Hotel, Plymouth. Any particulars not mentioned in the bills would be readily furnished on application at the office of the vendor solicitors, and parties wishing to inspect the premises might obtain the keys from Miss Belcher's lodge-keeper, Mr. Polklace, that is to say, from the nearest dwelling-house down the road. Pliny, with the help of half a dozen of Miss Belcher's men and a couple of wagons, had employed these 3 days in removing our furniture to the great cricket pavilion above the hill, an excellent storehouse where, for the time, it would remain in charge of Mr. Saunders, the head keeper. We ourselves removed to the shelter of Miss Belcher's lordly roof, as her guests, and Anne, the cook, to a cottage on the home farm, where that lady, who usually superintended her own dairy, had offered her the post of locum tenens until our return from foreign travel. By the morning when the bill poster came and affixed the notice of sale, Minden Cottage stood dismantled, a melancholy shell, inhabited only by memories for us, and for our country neighbours by mysterious ghostly terrors. This was one of the many grounds on which we agreed that the Lord Chancellor had acted foolishly in insisting upon a public auction. His lordship, to be sure, could not be expected to know that recent events had utterly depreciated the selling value of Minden Cottage over the whole of the south and east of Cornwall, that the homeward trudging labourer would breathe a prayer as he neared it along the high road in the dark, and would shut his eyes and run by it, nor draw breath until he reached the lodge down the road, that quite a number of Christian folk who had used to envy my father the snuggest little retreat within 20 miles would now have refused £100 to spend one night in it. So it was, however, and the chance of an outbidder might be passed over as negligible. On the other hand, Miss Belcher had offered Messrs. Harding and Whiteway a handsome and more than sufficient price for the property. She wanted it to round off her estate, out of which, at present, it cut a small cantle at an awkward corner. Moreover, if Miss Belcher had not come forward, Pliny was prepared to purchase. That Miss Belcher would acquire the place no one doubted. Still, a public sale it had to be. Early in the afternoon of the 5th, she left us for Plymouth, to make arrangements for the bidding. I did not see her depart, having been occupied since 5 in the morning in a glorious otter hunt, for which Mr. Rogers had brought over his hounds. The heat of the day found us far upstream, and a good 10 miles from home, and by the time Mr. Rogers had returned his pack to Miss Belcher's hospitable kennels, the sun was low in the west. I know nothing that will make a man more honestly dirty than a long otter hunt, followed by a perspiring tramp along a dusty road. From feet to waist, I was a cake of dried mud overlaid with dust. I had dust in my hair, in the creases of my clothes, in the pores of my skin. I needed ablution far beyond the resources of Miss Belcher's establishment, which, to tell the truth, left a good deal to seek in the apparatus of personal cleanliness, and, snatching up the clean shirt and suit of clothes which the ever-provident Pliny had laid out on the bed for me, I ran down across the park to the stream under the plantation. Little rain had fallen for a month past, and, arriving at the pool, on which I had counted for a bath, I found it almost dry. While I stood there, in 2 minds whether to return or to strip and make the best of it, I bethought me that, although I had never bathed there in my life, the stream would be better worth trying where it ran through the now deserted garden of Minden Cottage, below the summer-house. The bottom might be muddy, but the dam, which my father had built there, secured a sufficiency of water in the hottest months. I picked up my clothes again, and, following the stream up to the little door in the garden wall, pushed open the rusty latch and entered the garden. The hour, as I have said, was drawing on to dusk, and though, perhaps, I ought to say I am by nature not inclined to nervousness, or I had not ventured so near that particular spot, yet scared enough I was, as I stepped on to the little footbridge, to see a man standing by the doorway of the summer-house. For an instant, a terror seized me that it might be a ghost, or worse, the man himself, Aaron Glass. But a second glance, as I halted on a hair-trigger, so to speak, to turn and run for my life, assured me that the man was a stranger. He wore a suit of black, and a soft hat of Panama straw with a broad brim, and held in his hand a something strange to me, and indeed as almost unknown in England, an umbrella. It had a dusky white covering, and he held it by the middle, as though he had been engaged in taking measurements with it when my entrance surprised him. It appeared to me for the moment that I had not only surprised him, but frightened him, for the face he turned to me wore a yellowish pallor like that of old ivory. Yet when he drew himself up and spoke, I seemed to know in an instant that this was his natural color. The face itself was large and fleshy, with bold, commanding features, a face, on second thoughts, impossible to connect with terror. "Hullo, little boy! What are you doing in this garden?" I answered him, stammering, that I was come to bathe, and while I answered I was still in two minds about running, for his voice, appearance, bearing, all alike, puzzled me. He spoke genially, with something foreign in his accent. I could not determine his age at all. At first glance he seemed to be quite an old man, and not only old, but weary. Yet he walked without a stoop, and as he came slowly across the turf to the bridge end, I saw that his hair was black and glossy, and his large face unwrinkled as a child's. "Not after the plums, eh?" "No, sir, and besides," said I, picking up my courage, "there's no harm if I am. The garden belongs to me." "So?" He regarded me for some seconds, his hands clasping the umbrella behind his back. The sight of the bundle of black clothes I carried apparently satisfied him. "Then you have a right to know what brings me here." I answer, curiosity. "What became of the man who did it?" he asked, with a glance over his shoulder towards the summer-house. "Nobody knows, sir," I answered, recovering myself. "Disappeared, hey?" "Yes, sir." "I fancy that I could put my hand on him," he said very coolly, after a pause, "and I began to think I had to deal with a madman. Suppose, now, that I do catch him," he went on after a pause. "What shall I do with him? In my country, for I live a great way off, we either choke a murderer or we cut his head off with a knife." I told him, since he waited for me to say something, how in England we disposed of our worst criminals. "No, you don't," he said quietly. "You let some of the worst go, and the very worst, as you believe, you banish to an island, treating them as the old Romans treated theirs. Now, I'm a traveller, and where do you suppose I spend this day month?" I could not give a guess. "Why, on the island of Elba. I'm curious, you know, especially in the matter of criminals, so I came, a tremendous way, to have a look at Napoleon Bonaparte there. Now, I'll tell you another thing. He's going to escape in a month or two, when his plans are ready. I had that from his own lips, and, what's more, I heard it again in Paris a week later. From Paris I came across to London, and from London down to Plymouth, and from Plymouth I was to have travelled straight to Falmouth, to take my passage home, when I heard of what happened here, and that the house was for sale. So I stopped to have a look at it, for I am curious, I tell you." He went on to prove his curiosity by asking me a score of questions about myself. My age, my choice of a profession, my relatives (I told him I had none), and my schooling. He drew me, I cannot remember how, into a description of Pliny, and agreed with me that she must be a woman in 1,000, asked where she lived at present, and regretted, pulling out his watch, that he had not time to make her acquaintance. Oddly enough, I felt when he said it that this was no idle speech, but that only time prevented him from walking up the hill and paying his respects. I felt also, the longer we talked, I will not say a fear of him, for his manner was too urbane to permit it, but an increasing respect. Crazed he might be, as his questions were disconnected and now and again bewildering, as when he asked if my father had travelled much abroad, and again I really preferred to remain idle at home instead of returning to finish my education with Mr. Stimcoe. But his manner of asking compelled an answer. I could not tell myself if I liked or disliked this man, he differed so entirely from any one I had ever seen in my life. His questions were intimate, yet without offence. I answered them all, with a sense of talking to someone either immensely old or divided from me by hundreds of miles. In the midst of our talk, and while he was pressing me with questions about Mr. and Mrs. Stimcoe, he suddenly lifted his head and stood listening. "Hullo," said he. "Here's the coach." I had heard nothing, though my ears are pretty sharp. But sure enough, though not until a couple of minutes had passed, the wheels of the Highflyer, our evening coach to Plymouth, sounded far along the road. The stranger pulled out a bunch of keys from his pocket. "I will ask you as a favor," said he, "to return these to the lodge-keeper, from whom I borrowed them. Will you be so kind?" I said that I would do so with pleasure. I have been over the house. It appears, the lodge-keeper tells me, that I have been almost the only visitor to inspect it. That's queer, for I should have thought that to an amateur in crime, with a taste for discovery, it offered great possibilities. But never mind, child, said this strange man, and shook hands. I have great hopes of finding the scoundrel, and of dealing with him. Eh? How? Well, if we get him upon an island, he shan't get away, like Napoleon. With these words, which I did not understand in the least, he turned and left me, passing out into the lane by the side gate. A minute later I heard the coach pull up, and yet a minute later roll on again, conveying him towards Plymouth. I stole a glance at the water, at the summer house, at the tree behind it. Somehow in the twilight they all wore an uncanny look. On my way home, for I decided to return and take my bath in the house after all, my mind kept running on a story of Anne the cook's, about a man, a relative of hers, she said, who had once seen the devil. And yet the stranger had tipped me a guinea at parting, nor was it, except metaphorically, red hot in my pocket. Next evening Miss Belcher rode back to us from Plymouth with the announcement that Minden Cottage was hers. She had not attended the sale in person, but Maddicombe, her lawyer, had started the bidding, under her instruction, at precisely the sum which she had privately offered Messrs. Harding and Whiteway. There was no competition. In fact, Maddicombe reported that, apart from the auctioneers and himself, but 6 persons attended the sale. Of these, 5 were local acquaintances of his whom he knew to be attracted only by curiosity. Of the 6th, a stranger, he had been afraid at first, but the man appeared to be a visitor, who had wandered into the sale by mistake. At any rate, he made no bid. What sort of man? I asked. As to that, Maddicombe had no very precise recollection, or couldn't put it into words. A tall man, he said, and dressed in black. A noticeable man. That was as far as he could get. And, he believed, a foreigner. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Logan Lorenz. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 23. How we sailed to the island. The business of the sale concluded, we had nothing to detain us, and an order was at once sent to Captain Branscombe to book our passages in the next packet for the West Indies. Meanwhile, we held long discussions on details of outfit, for since our impedimenta included 2 moderately heavy chests, the one of guns and ammunition, the other of spades, picks, hatchets, and other tools, and since on reaching Jamaica we must take a considerable journey on muleback, it was important to cut our personal luggage down to the barest necessities. We did not forget a medicine chest. On August 28th, we received word from Captain Branscombe that he had taken berths for us on the Townshend packet commanded by an old friend of his, a Captain Harrison. She was due to set sail on the 1st. Accordingly, on August 30th, we travelled down by Royal Mail to Falmouth. Mr. Rogers, following that same noon by the Highflyer, spent a busy day in making some last purchases, and a sleepless night in the noisiest of hotels, and went on board soon after breakfast, to be welcomed there by Mr. Goodfellow, who had got over his parting 3 days before at Plymouth, and professed himself to be in the very jolliest of spirits. At the head of the after companion, Captain Branscombe met us and conducted us below, to introduce us to our quarters and be complimented on the thought and care he had bestowed in choosing them and fitting them up, for the ladies' comfort especially. He himself lodged forward, in a small double cabin which he shared with Mr. Goodfellow. I will spare the reader a description of our departure and of the passage to Jamaica, not only because they were quite uneventful, we did not even sight a privateer, but because they have been celebrated in verse by Pliny, in a descriptive poem of 5 cantos and some 4,000 lines, entitled The Voyage, with an Englishwoman's reflections on her favourite element, a few extracts from which I am permitted to quote. We sailed for Kingston in the Townshend packet. The day auspicious was, and calm the heavens. Not so the scene on board. Oh, what a racket! And everything on deck apparently at 6s and 7s. Mail bags and passengers mixed up in every direction. The latter engaged with their relatives in fond farewells. On the one hand the faltering accents of affection, on the other the unpolished seamen emitting yells, with criticisms of the custom house official, whose action for some reason they resented as prejudicial. At length the last farewell is said, the anchor tripped, the gangway cleared, 'twas 5 p.m. ere past Pendennis Head. Forth to the unfathomable deep we steered. The boatswain piped, he wore a manly beard. And while the attentive crew the braces trimmed, alluding to the ships, and while from observation the coast receded, we with eyes bedimmed, indulged in feelings natural to the situation. Albion, my Albion, so called from the hue, thy cliffs wear by the straits of Dover, though darker in this neighbourhood, still, adieu. Albion, adieu. I feel myself a rover. Thy sons instinctively take to the water, and so will I, albeit but a daughter. A page later, in more tripping metre, which reflects her gaiety of spirits, she describes the ship. The Townshend packet is a gallant brig of 180 tons. 'Tis the Postmaster General's favourite rig, and she carries 6 useful guns. As she sails, with His Majesty's mails, hurrah for her long 6-pounders! They relieve our fear of a privateer. But what shall we do if she founders? I prefer not to think of any such contingency. She has excellent sailing qualities, and her captain appears to rule with stringency, and to be averse from minor frivolities. With the late Admiral Nelson he may not provoke comparison, but one and all place implicit confidence in Captain Harrison. While Pliny cultivated the muse, and with the more zest as to her pride and delight, she found herself immune from seasickness, I kept up, through the long mornings, the pretence of studying mathematics with Captain Branscombe, and regularly at noon received a lesson in taking the ship's bearings. Our fellow voyagers were mostly merchants and agents bound for Jamaica, the trade of which had revived since the restoration of peace, and among them we passed for a well-to-do family, travelling partly for pleasure to visit the island, but partly also with an idea of buying a plantation and settling there, which explained the presence of Mr. Goodfellow. Our captain justified the confidence so poetically expressed above. He sailed his ship along steadily, taking no risks, and after a pleasant passage of 36 days, brought her to anchor in Carlisle Bay, Barbados, where we were due to deliver some bags of mails. I have said that the trip was uneventful. It was even without incident save for some fooleries on reaching the line, and such trifling distractions as an unsuccessful attempt to shoot an albatross, and the sighting of some flying fish and sundry long-tailed birds which the sailors called boatswains. But, as Pliny wrote, life at sea has a natural monotony, of which 'twere irrational to complain. You cannot, for instance, study botany, as in an English country lane, but the mind is superior to distance, with its own reminiscences stored, not to mention the spiritual assistance we derived from a clergyman on board. He was a sallow young man of delicate constitution, and, partly for his health's sake, had accepted the pastorate of a Genevan church in Kingston. From Barbados we beat up for Jamaica, and anchored in Kingston Harbour just 45 days from home. The next morning we said farewell to the ship, and were rowed ashore to a good hotel, where we spent a lazy week in email excursions, while Captain Branscombe busied himself in hiring a mule train and holding consultations with a firm of merchants, Messrs. Cox and Roebuck, to whom Miss Belcher came recommended with a letter of credit. These gentlemen, understanding that we desired to cross over to the Main to visit some relations of Miss Belcher, resident in Virginia, for that was our pretense, opined that the matter was not difficult of management, but that we must needs travel to the extreme west of the island if we would hire a vessel for the purpose, and they mentioned an agent of theirs at Savannah-la-Mar, Jacob Paz by name, as the likeliest man for our purpose. Armed with a letter of introduction to this man, in the early morning of October 22nd, we started on muleback, and traveling without haste through the exquisite scenery of Jamaica, the main roads of which put ours of Cornwall to shame, arrived at Savannah-la-Mar on the 27th, a great part of the way having been occupied by Miss Belcher, who hated the sight of a negro, in rebuking Pliny's sentimental objections to slavery, and by Mr. Rogers in begging a collection of hummingbirds. It took, I believe, some time at Savannah-la-Mar to convince Mr. Paz, a subtle half-breed, that we were actually fools enough to wish to purchase one of his vessels, and mad enough to propose working her alone. He had 3 boats idle, including a pretty little fore and aft schooner of 30 tons, the Espriella, which Captain Branscome had no sooner set eyes upon than he decided to be the very thing for our purpose. She was fitted with a large ladies' cabin aft of the companion, a saloon, and a small single-berth cabin between it and the forecastle, which would house 3 men comfortably. We ended by purchasing her for £370, and into the forecastle I went with Mr. Goodfellow and Mr. Jack Rogers, who insisted on resigning the spare cabin to Captain Branscome, henceforward, or until we should reach the island, by consent the leader of the expedition. So, on October 30th, at 6 in the morning, after being commended to God by Mr. Paz, we worked out of Savannah-la-Mar, and having gained an offing with a light breeze, hoisted all our bits of canvas, even to a light jib topsail we found on board, chiefly I think to impress her late owner, whom we could descry on the shore, watching us. He had steadfastly refused to believe us capable of handling a boat, whereas of our party, Pliny and Mr. Goodfellow were the only landlubbers. Miss Belcher could take the helm with the best of us, and indeed it was reported of her that she had on more than one occasion played helmswoman to a run of goods upon her own Cornish estate. Mr. Jack Rogers had once owned a yacht and suffered from tedium. Now, as a foremast hand, he was enjoying himself amazingly. But the pride above all pride was Captain Branscome's. After many years he trod a deck again, commander of his own ship, and the bearing of the man was that of a prince restored after long exile to his kingdom. Courteous as ever to the ladies, to the rest of us he behaved as a master, noble but severe, unwearied in explaining the least minutiae of seamanship, inexorable in seeing that his smallest instruction was obeyed. Mr. Rogers at the end of the first day confided to me that he had much ado to refrain from touching his forelock whenever he heard the skipper's voice. I shall not be believed if I say that in all the 5 days of our voyage Captain Branscome never snatched a wink of sleep. Doubtless he did sleep between whiles, but doubtless also no one saw him do it. It was daybreak or thereabouts on the morning of November 5th, and a faint light coming through the deck light over the forecastle, when I, that had kept the middle watch and was now snoring in my bunk, sat up at a touch on my shoulder and stared, rubbing my eyes, into the dim face of Mr. Goodfellow. "Skipper wants you on deck," he announced. "We've lifted something on the starboard bow, and he swears 'tis the island." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Logan Lorenz. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 24. We Anchor Off the Island. The word fetched me out of my bunk like a shot from a gun. I ran past him, scrambled up the forecastle ladder, and gained the deck in time to see Miss Belcher emerge from the after companion upon the dawn, her hair in a bun, her bare feet thrust into loose felt slippers, her form wrapped in a Newmarket overcoat closely buttoned over her robe de nuit. "The island, ma'am," announced Captain Branscome from the helm, and turning there by the forecastle hatch and following the gesture of his hand, I descried a purplish smear on the southern horizon. To me, it looked but a low-lying cloud or a fog bank. "I'll take your word for it," answered Miss Belcher, calmly. "You have timed it well, Captain Branscombe." "Under Providence, ma'am," the captain corrected her, and called to me to take the wheel while he fetched out his chart and unrolled it for her inspection. "We are running straight down upon the northern end of it, and our best anchorage, if I may suggest, lies to the southward, in Gow's Creek, as they call it." He laid a finger on the chart. "We rely upon you, sir, to choose." "I thank you, ma'am. If, as I doubt not, we find plenty of water there, it will be the best anchorage in this breeze, not to mention that this Gow's Creek runs up, as we are directed, to within 1.5 miles of the No. 3 cache. If you agree, ma'am, I have only to ask your instructions whether to coast down the east or the west side of the island. The wind, you perceive, serves equally well for both." Miss Belcher considered for a moment. "The Keys lie to the west of Gable Point, here. By taking that side, we can have a look at them on our way." "Right, ma'am. Harry!" He turned to me. "Bring your nose round to southwest and by south, and stand by for the jibe." He hauled in the mainsheet and eased it over. "Now, see here, lad," he called to me sharply as the little vessel yawed. "Where were your eyes just then?" "I was taking a look at the landfall, sir," I answered truthfully. "Then I'll trouble you to fix your mind on the lubber's mark and hold her straight. That's discipline, my boy, and in this business you may want all you can learn of it." It was not Captain Branscome's habit to speak sharply. I turned my attention to the card, conscious of a pair of red ears. The sky brightened, and within an hour, as we ran down upon it at something like 8 knots, the island began to take shape. A wisp of morning fog floated horizontally across it, dividing its shoreline from the hills in the interior, which, looming above this cloudy base, appeared considerably higher than, in fact, they were. The shore itself, along the eastern side, showed almost uniformly steep, a line of reddish rock broken with patches of green, which we mistook for meadows, but they turned out to be nothing more or less than sheets of green creepers matted together and overhanging the cliffs. At its northern extremity, upon which we were closing down at an acute angle, the land dropped to a low-lying, sandy peninsula with a backbone of rock almost bare of vegetation, and beyond this we saw the white surf glittering around the Keys. Our course gave them a fairly wide berth, and at first I took them for a continuous line of sandbanks running in a rough semicircle around the low spit which the chart called Gable Point, but as we drew level they broke up into islets, with blue channels between, and at sight of us thousands of seabirds rose in cloud upon cloud, with a clamor that might have been heard for miles. One of these banks, the northernmost, showed traces of herbage, gray in color and dull by contrast with the verdure of the island. The rest were but barren sand. We rounded them at about 3 cables' length, and stood due south, giving sheet again. Southward from the neck of the peninsula, this western side of the island differed surprisingly from the other. Here were no cliffs, but a flat shore and long stretches of beach, gradually shelving up to green bush, with here a palmetto grove, and there a lagoon of still water within the outer barrier of sand. Mr. Jack Rogers had relieved me at the helm, and with the captain's permission I had stepped below to the saloon, where Pliny was waiting to give me breakfast, and persuaded the good soul not only to let me carry it on deck and eat it there, but to postpone washing up for a while and accompany me. To this she would by no means consent until I had brought her the captain's leave. "You may take her, my leave," said he, with a sudden flush on his face, "and my apologies for having neglected to request the honor of her company. The fact is," he added, with a hard glance at me, "Miss Plinlimmon's sense of discipline is so rare a thing that I am always forgetting to do justice to it. Were it possible to find a whole crew so conscientious, I would undertake to sail to the North Pole." I conveyed this answer to Pliny, and it visibly gratified her. She retired at once to the ladies' cabin to endue her poke bonnet with conquillicot trimmings. Her apron she retained, observing that on an expedition of this sort one should never be taken at unawares, and that when at Rome you should do as the Romans did. "By which, my dear Harry," she explained, You are not to understand me to refer to their Papist observances, such as kissing a man's toe. Were such a request proffered to me even at the cannon's mouth, I trust my courage would find an answer. No, no, I would say. I will not bow within the house of Rimmon. Yours faithfully, Amelia Plinlimmon. As we reached the head of the companion ladder, Captain Branscombe, who was standing just after the wheel, behind Mr. Roger's shoulder, and scanning the shore through his glass, made a motion to step forward and hand her on deck. This was ever his courteous way, and I turned a moment later in some surprise to find that, instead of closing the glass, he had lifted it and was holding it again to his eye, at the same time keeping his right shoulder turned to us. While we looked, he lowered it and made his bow, yet with something of a preoccupied air. "Good morning, ma'am. You are very welcome on deck, and I trust that Harry conveyed the apology I sent by him." "I beg you will not mention it, sir. It is true that I have suffered from the curiosity which outspoken critics have called the bane of my sex, yet, believe me, I was far from accusing you, knowing how many responsibilities must weigh on the captain of an expedition, even though it fare as prosperously as ours." "True, ma'am." Captain Branscombe tapped his spyglass absent-mindedly, and seemed on the point of lifting it again. "Though, with your permission, I will add D.V." "Yes, yes." Pliny smiled a cheerful approval. "We are ever in the divine hand. Not more really, perhaps, in the tropics than those more temperate latitudes, when, though the wolf and lion do not howl for prey, an incautious step upon a piece of orange peel has before now proved equally fatal." Captain Branscombe bowed again. "You call me the leader of this expedition, Miss Plinlimmon, and so I am, until we drop anchor. With that, in 2 or 3 hours at farthest, my chief responsibility ends, and I think it time," he turned to Mr. Rogers, "that we made ready to appoint my successor. I shall have a word to say to him." "Nonsense, man," answered Mr. Rogers, looking up from the wheel. "If you mean me, I decline to act except as your lieutenant. You have captained us admirably, and if I decline the honour, you will hardly suggest promoting Harry here, or Goodfellow." "I was thinking that Miss Belcher, perhaps—" "Hullo!" said Miss Belcher, turning at the sound of her name, and coming aft from the bows, whence she had been studying the coastline. "What's the matter with me?" "The captain," exclaimed Mr. Rogers, "has been tendering us his resignation." "Why?" "Mr. Rogers misunderstands me, ma'am," said Captain Branscombe. "I merely said that, so far as we have agreed as yet, my authority ceases as soon as we cast anchor. If you choose to re-elect me, I shall not say no, though not coveting the honour, but I can only say yes upon a condition." "Name it, please." "That I have everyone's implicit obedience. I may, nay, I shall, give orders that will be irksome, and at the same time hard to understand. I may be unable to give you my reasons for them, or able to give you none beyond the general warning that we are after treasure, and I never yet heard of a treasure hunt that was child's play." He spoke quietly, but with an impressiveness not to be mistaken, though we knew no cause for it. Miss Belcher, at any rate, did not miss it. She shot him a keen glance, turned for a moment, and seemed to study the shore, then faced about again, and said she, "I am not used to be commanded, but I can command myself, and am not altogether a fool." The captain bowed. "I was thinking, ma'am, that might be our difficulty. But if I have your word to try, you have. I thank you, ma'am, and will own that my mind is relieved. It may even be that, from time to time, I may do myself the honour of consulting you. Nevertheless, I mustn't count on it, eh? Well, as you please. Only I warn you that, while in any case I am going to be as good as my word, if you treat me like a sensible person, I shall probably be a trifle better." For 10 seconds, maybe, the pair looked one another in the eyes. Then the captain bowed once more, and apparently this invited her to step forward with him to the bows, where they halted and stood conning the coast, the captain through his spyglass. As they left us, Pliny and I moved to the waist of the ship, where we paused by consent, and I resumed my breakfast, munching it as I leaned against the port bulwarks. We were now rapidly opening Long Bay, as the chart called it, a deep recess running out squarely at either extremity, the bight of it crossed by a beach, and a line of tumbling breakers that extended for close to 3 miles. Above the beach, a forest of tall trees, in height and color at once distinguishable from the thick bush we had hitherto been passing, screened the bases of a range of hills that obviously formed the backbone of the island, and as the whole bay crept into view, we discerned in the north, or, to be accurate, north-northeast, corner of this long recess a marshy valley dividing the scrub from the forest. The mouth of this valley, where it widened out upon the beach, measured at least half a mile across. The chart marked it as Misery Swamp, and indicated a river there. We could detect none, or at any rate no river entrance. If river there were, doubtless it emptied its waters through the fringe of grey-green weeds, and dispersed over the flat-looking foreshore. But even at 2 miles' distance it looked to be a dismal, fever-haunted spot. By contrast, the noble range of woodland to southward of it, and the rocky peaks that rose in delicate shadows above the treetops, were beautiful as a dream, even to eyes fresh from the forest scenery of Jamaica. And while Pliny leant with me against the bulwarks, I felt that in the silence immortal verse was shaping itself, which it did, after a while, to this effect. Arrived o'er the limitless ocean, in 16 degrees of north latitude, our lips were attuned to devotion, our spirits uplifted in gratitude. Our hearts with poetic afflatus took wing and impulsively soared, as the lead line, a quaint apparatus, reported the depth overboard. Oh, oft had I dreamed of the tropics, but never to see them in person, so full of remarkable topics, to speculate, sing, and converse on. It was Mr. Goodfellow who worked the hand lead, under Captain Branscome's orders, from a perch just forward of the main rigging, but at a mile's distance. We carried deep water with us past Crabtree Point, and around the unnamed small cape which formed the southwestern extremity of the island. We rounded this, and hauling up to the wind, found, as the reader may discover for himself by a glance at the chart, that the shore made almost directly east by north, with scarcely an indentation for Gow's Gulf. Here the water shoaled, though for the first mile almost imperceptibly. The inlet itself resembled the estuary of a mighty river, its both sides well wooded, though very different in configuration, the northern rising quietly from shelving beaches of coral-white sand to some of the most respectable hills in the island, while that on our starboard hand presented a succession of cliff and chasm, the cliffs varying, as we judged, from 200 to 250 feet sheer. In 3½ fathoms, reported by Mr. Goodfellow, the water, which was exquisitely clear, showed good white sand under us. Ahead of us, the creek narrowed, promising an anchorage almost completely landlocked, and as peaceful as the soul of man could desire. We drew a short 8 feet of water, and with such surroundings, for the tide had not been making above an hour, I expected the old man to hold on for at least another mile, when, to my surprise, he took the helm from Mr. Rogers, and, sending him forward, shook the Espriella up in the wind, at the same time calling to Goodfellow and me to lower the main throat halyards. "Leave go anchor!" With a splash, her anchor plunged over, took the ground, and in another 20 yards brought us up standing. "Hullo!" Miss Belcher scanned the shore. "You're giving the boats a long trip, Captain." "I take my precautions, ma'am," answered Captain Branscome, almost curtly. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Schmidt. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 25. I Take French Leave Ashore. In a sweating hurry, I helped Mr. Rogers and Mr. Goodfellow to furl sail, coil away ropes, and tidy up generally. After these tedious weeks at sea, I was wild for a run ashore, and, with the green woods inviting me, grudged even an hour's delay. We had run down foresail,
and come to our anchor under jib and half-lowered mainsail. I sprang forward to take in the jib and carry it, with the foresail, to the locker aft the ladies' cabin, when Captain Branscome sang out to me to be in no such hurry, but to fold and stow both sails neatly without detaching them, the one along the bowsprit and the other at the foot of the forestay, when they could be rehoisted at a moment's notice. These precautions were the more mysterious to me, because a moment later he sent me to the locker to fetch up a tarpaulin cover for the mainsail, which he snugged down carefully, to protect it, as he explained, from the night dews, so carefully that he twice interrupted Mr. Goodfellow to correct a piece of slovenly tying. The sail being packed at length to his satisfaction, we laced the cover about it carefully, as though it had been a lady's bodice. Our next business was to get out the boats. The Espriella possessed 3, a gig, shaped somewhat like a whaleboat, a useful 12-foot dinghy, and a small cockboat, or punt, to use our West Country name, capable, at a pinch, of accommodating 2 persons. This last we carried on deck, but the larger pair at the foot of the rigging on either side, whence we unlashed and lowered them by their falls. The punt we moored by a short painter under the bowsprit, so that she lay just clear of our stem. This small job had fallen to me by the captain's orders, and I clambered back to find him and Mr. Rogers standing by the accommodation ladder on the port side, and in the act of stepping down into the dinghy. Indeed, Mr. Rogers had his foot on the ladder, and seemed to wait only while the captain gave some instructions to Mr. Goodfellow, who was listening respectfully. "Are we all to go ashore in the dinghy?" I asked. The captain turned on me severely, and I observed that he and Mr. Rogers had armed themselves with a musket apiece, each slung on a bandolier, and that Mr. Rogers wore an axe at his belt. "Certainly not," said the captain. "Mr. Rogers and I are going on shore to prospect, and I was at this moment instructing Mr. Goodfellow that nobody is to leave the ship without leave from me." "But," I began, and checked myself, less for fear of his anger than because I was actually on the verge of tears. I looked around for the ladies, but they had retired to their cabin. Oh, this was a hard, monstrous tyranny, and so I told Mr. Goodfellow hotly, as the dinghy pushed off, and, Mr. Rogers paddling her, drew away up the creek and rounded the bend under the almost overhanging trees. "When are they coming back?" I demanded. "Captain didn't say." "You seem to take it easily," I flamed up, "but I call it a burning shame. Captain Branscome seems to think that this island belongs to him, and you know well enough, if it hadn't been for me, he'd never have set eyes on it. What are you going to do?" "Smoke a pipe," said Mr. Goodfellow, "and watch the beauties o' nature." "Well, I'm not," I threatened. "Captain Branscome may be a very good seaman, but he's too much of an usher out of school. This isn't Stimcoe's." "Not a bit like it," assented Mr. Goodfellow, feeling in his pockets. "And if he thinks he can go on playing the usher over me, he'll find out his mistake. Why, look you, who has the treasure, properly speaking? Who found it?" "Nobody yet." Mr. Goodfellow drew forth a pipe and rubbed the bowl thoughtfully against his nose. "Well, then, who found the chart? Who put you all on the scent? Who was it first heard the secret from Captain Coffin? And this man doesn't even consult me. Doesn't think me worth a civil word. I'll be shot if I stand it." I wound up pacing the deck in my rage. Just then Plinny's voice called up to us from the cabin, announcing that dinner was ready. "But," she said, "one of you must eat his portion on deck while he keeps watch. That was Captain Branscome's order." "More orders!" I grumbled, and then, with a sudden thought, I nodded to Mr. Goodfellow, who was replacing his pipe in his pocket. "You go. Hand me up a plate and a fistful of ship biscuit, and leave me to deal with them. I'm not for stifling down there under hatches, whatever your taste may be. 'Tis a fact," he admitted, "that a meal does me more good when I square my elbows to it." "Down you go, then," said I, "and when you're wanted I'll call you." He descended cheerfully, reappeared to pass up a plate, and descended again. I gobbled down enough to stay my appetite, crammed my pocket full of ship biscuit, and after listening for a moment at the hatchway, tiptoed forward and climbed out upon the bowsprit. Then, having unloosed the cockboat's painter, I lowered and let myself drop into her, and, slipping a paddle into the stern notch, sculled gently for shore. The Espriella, of course, lay head to tide, and the tide by this time was making strongly, so strongly that I had no time to get steerage way on the little boat before it swept her close under the open porthole, through which I heard Miss Belcher inviting Mr. Goodfellow to pass his plate for another dumpling. Miss Belcher's voice, as I may or may not have informed the reader, was a baritone of singularly resonant timbre. It sounded through the porthole as through a speaking trumpet, and I ducked and held my breath as the boat's gunwale rubbed twice against the schooner's side before drifting clear. Once clear, however, I worked my paddle with a will, though noiselessly, and, the tide helping me, soon reached and rounded the first bend. Here, out of sight of the ship, I had leisure to draw breath and look about me. Ahead of me lay a still reach, close upon half a mile in length, and narrowing steadily to the next bend, when the two shores overlapped and mingled their reflections on the water. On my right the red cliffs, their summits matted with creepers, descended sheer into water many fathoms deep, yet so clear that I could spy the fish playing about their bases where they met the firm white sand. On my left the channel shoaled gradually to a beach, of this the same white sand, which followed the curve of the shore, here and again flashing out into broad sunshine from the blue shadow cast by the overhanging forest. Between these banks the breeze could scarcely be felt, yet, though the sun scorched me, the heat was not oppressive. The woods, dense and tangled though they were, threw up no exhalations of mud or rotting leaves, but a clean, aromatic odor. It seemed to give them a substance without which they had been but a mirage, a scene painted on a cloth. So motionless and apparently lifeless they stood, with the long vines hanging from their boughs, and the hot, rarefied air quivering above them. At first their silence daunted me. By and by I felt, I could hardly be said to hear, that this silence was intense, and held a sound of its own, a murmur as of millions of flies and minute winged things, or perhaps it came from the vegetation itself, and the sap pushing leaf against leaf, and ceaselessly striving for room. With scarcely more noise than the forest made in growing, I let the cockboat float up on the tide, correcting her course from time to time with a touch of the paddle astern, and so coming to the second bend, began to search the shore for a convenient landing. The captain and Mr. Rogers, no doubt, had rowed up to the very head of the creek, and would by this time be prospecting for the clump of trees which were the key to unlock number 3 cache. To escape, or at any rate delay detection, I must land lower down, and preferably at some point where I could pull up the boat and hide it. With this in mind, scanning the woods on the north bank for an opening, I drifted around the bend, and with a shock of surprise found myself in full view of the end of the creek. Worse than this, I was bearing straight for the Esprilla's dinghy, which lay just above the water on the foreshore, with her painter carried out to a tree above the bank. Worst of all, someone at that instant stepped back from the bank and under the shadow of the tree, as if to wait me there. Mr. Rogers, or the captain? Mr. Rogers certainly, for I remembered that the captain wore white duck trousers, and by my glimpse of him this man's clothes were dark. His height and walk too. Yes, no doubt of it, he was Mr. Rogers. I stood, a culprit caught red-handed, and let the boat drift me down upon retributive justice. A while ago I had been mentally composing a number of effective retorts upon Captain Branscome for his tyrannical behavior. Now, of a sudden, all this eloquence deserted me. I felt it leaking away, and knew myself for a lawbreaker. One lingering hope remained, that the captain had pushed ahead into the woods, and that as yet Mr. Jack Rogers, whose good nature I might almost count upon, had alone detected me, and would pack me home to the ship with nothing worse than a flea in my ear. His silence encouraged this hope. Half a minute passed, and still he forbore to lift his voice and summon me. He stood, deep in the shadow, his face screened by the boughs, and made no motion to advance to the bank. Then suddenly, at maybe 200 yards distance, I saw him take another pace backwards and slip away among the trees. Good man, thought I, and blessed him. After my first start of astonishment, he has pretended not to see me. At any rate, he had given me a pretty good hint to make myself scarce unless I wished to incur Captain Branscome's wrath. I slipped my paddle forward into a rowlock, picked up the other, and, dropping upon the thwart, jerked the cock-boat right about face to head her back for the schooner. But after a stroke or two I eased, and let her drift back, stern foremost, while I sat considering. Mr. Rogers had behaved like a trump, yet it seemed mean to deceive the old man, and, moreover, it amounted to striking my colors. I had broken orders deliberately, and because I denied his right to give such orders. I might be a youngster, but to say the least of it, I had as much interest in the success of this expedition as any member of the company. The shortest way to dissuade Captain Branscome from treating me as a child was to assert myself from the beginning. I had started with full intent to assert myself, and yes, I was much obliged to Mr. Rogers, but this question between me and Branscome had best be settled, though it meant open mutiny. I felt pretty sure that Miss Belcher would support the tyrant, almost equally sure that Pliny would acquiesce, though her sympathy went with me. And strangely enough, and unjustly, I felt the angrier with Pliny. But even against Miss Belcher I had a card to play. Captain Branscome may be an excellent leader, I would say, but I beg you to remember that you gave me no vote in electing him. I will obey any leader I have my share in choosing, but until then I stand out. And I had an inkling that, though the public voice would be against me, I should establish my claim to be taken into any future councils. In for a lamb, in for a sheep, thought I, and began to back the cock-boat towards the corner where the dinghy lay. As I did so, it occurred to me to wonder why the captain and Mr. Rogers had been so dilatory. They must have started a full hour ahead of me. They had left the schooner at a brisk stroke, whereas I had merely floated up with the tide. Yet either I had all but surprised them in the act of stepping ashore, or, if they had landed at once, why had Mr. Rogers loitered on the bank until I was close on overtaking him? They had landed at the extreme head of the creek. Therefore, I argued, their intent was to follow up the stream where indicated on the chart and search for the clump of trees which guarded the secret of number 3 cache. Sure enough, having beached my boat alongside the dinghy and climbed the green knoll above the foreshore, I spied their footprints on the sandy edge of the stream, which here fetched a loop before joining the tidal waves of the creek. They led me along a flat meadow of exquisitely green turf, fringed with palmetto trees, to the entrance of a narrow gorge through which the stream came tumbling in a series of cascades, spraying the ferns that overhung it. The forest with its undergrowth pressed so closely upon either bank that after scrambling up beside the first waterfall I was forced to take off shoes and stockings and work my way up the irregular bed, now wading knee-deep, now clambering or leaping from boulder to boulder, and, even so, to press from time to time through the meeting boughs, shielding my face from scratches. So, for at least a mile, I climbed as through a narrow green tunnel, and at the end of it found myself wet to the skin. 5 waterfalls I had passed, and, beside the 4th, where the bank was muddy, had noted a long, smooth mark, and recent, such as a man's foot might make in slipping, so that I felt pretty confident of being on my companion's track, though I wondered how the captain, with his lame leg, could sustain such a climb. But above the 5th waterfall the stream divided into 2 branches, and at the fork of them I stood for a while in doubt which to choose. So far as volume of water went, there was indeed little or nothing to choose. If direction counted, the main stream would be that which came rushing down the gorge straight ahead of me, a gorge which, however, as my eye followed the V of its tree tops up to the skyline, promised to grow steeper and worse tangled. On the other hand, the tributary, as I shall call it, which poured down from a lateral valley on my left, ran with an easier flow, as though drawing its waters from less savage slopes. I could not see these slopes, a bend of the hills hid them, but I reasoned that if a clump of trees, separate and distinguishable, stood anywhere near the banks of either stream, it might possibly be found by this one. The other showed nothing but a close mass of vegetation. Accordingly, I turned my steps up the channel to the left, and was rewarded, after another 20 minutes' scramble, by emerging upon a break in the forest. On one side of the stream rose a reddish-colored cliff, almost smooth of face, and about 70 or 80 feet high, across the edge of which the last trees on the summit clutched with their naked roots, as though protesting against being thrust over the precipice by the crowd behind them. The other bank swelled up, from a little above the water's edge, to a fair green lawn, rounded, grassy, and smooth as a glade in an English park. At its widest I dare say that, from the stream's edge back to the steep slope, where the forest started again and climbed to a tall ridge that shut in the glen on the south side, it measured something over 200 yards. Here, thought I, glancing up the glade towards the westering sun, is the very spot for our clump of trees. And so it was, only no clump of trees happened to be in sight. The glade, however, stretched away and around a bend of the stream, and I was moving to the bank to explore it to its end when my eyes were arrested by something white not 10 paces away. It was a piece of paper caught against one of the large boulders between them, as through a broken dam the water poured into the ravine. I waded towards it and stopped, and stooped, steadying myself against the current. It was a paper boat. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Schmidt. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 26. The Women in the Graveyard. I turned it over in my hand. Yes, it was a boat such as children make out of paper, many times folded. And what on earth, thought I, put such childishness into the head of Captain Branscombe or Mr. Jack Rogers? Then it occurred to me that they might be caught in some peril higher up the stream, and had launched this message on the chance of its being carried down to the waters of the creek. A far-fetched explanation, to be sure, but what was I to think? If it were the explanation, doubtless the paper contained writing, and, carrying it to the bank, I seated myself, and began to unfold it very carefully, for it was sodden, and threatened to fall to pieces in my hands. Then I reflected that the 2 men carried no writing materials, or, at the best, a lead pencil, the marks of which would be obliterated before the paper had been 2 minutes in the water. Yet, as I parted the folds, I saw that the paper had indeed been scribbled on, though the words were a smear, and, moreover, that the writing was in ink. In ink! My fingers trembled, and involuntarily tore a small rent in the pulpy mass. I laid it on the grass to dry in the full sunshine, seated myself beside it, and looked around me with a shiver. A paper boat, the paper written on, and the writing in ink! I could be sworn that neither Captain Branscombe nor Mr. Rogers carried an ink bottle. The paper, too, was of a kind unfamiliar to me. Thin, foreign paper, ruled with faint lines in watermark. Certainly no one on board the Espriella owned such writing paper or the like of it. But again, the paper could not have been long in the water, and the writing seemed to be fresh. As the torn edges crinkled in the heat and curled themselves half open, I peered between them and distinguished a capital R followed by an I. But these letters ran into a long smear, impossible to decipher. I had flung myself prone on the grass, and so lay, with chin propped on both palms, staring at the thing as if it had been some strange beetle, staring till my eyes ached. But now I took it in my fingers again and prized the edges a little wider. Below the smear came a blank space, and below this were 5 lines ruled in ink, with a number of dotted marks between them. A smudged stave of music? Yes, certainly it was music. I could distinguish the mark of the treble clef. Lastly, at the foot of the page, as I unwrapped it at length, came a blurred, illegible signature. But what mattered the sense of it? The writing was here, and recent. No one on board the Espriella could have penned it. The island, then, was inhabited now, at this moment, inhabited, and the inhabitants, whoever they might be, at this moment not far from me. I crushed the paper into my pocket and stood up, slowly looking about me. For a second or two panic had me by the hair. I turned to run, but the dense woods through which I had ascended so light-heartedly had suddenly become a jungle of God knows what terrors. I remembered that from the first cascade upward I had scarcely once had a view of more than a dozen yards ahead, so thickly the bushes closed in upon me. I saw myself retracing my steps through those bushes, in every one of which now lurked a pair of watching eyes. I glanced up at the cliff across the stream. For aught I knew, eyes were watching me from its summit. Needless to say, I cursed the hour of my transgression, the fatal impulse that had prompted me to break ship. I knew myself for a fool. But how might I win back to repentance? As repent I certainly would and acknowledge my fault. Could I keep hold on my nerve to thread my way back and over those 5 separate and accursed waterfalls? If only I were given a clear space to run! At this point in the nexus of my fears, it occurred to me, glancing along the green lawn ahead, that the ridge on its left must run almost parallel with the creek, that it was sparsely wooded in comparison with the ravine behind me, and that from the summit of it I might even look straight down upon the Esprilla's anchorage. Be this as it might, I felt sure, considering the lie of the land, that here must be a short cut back to the creek, and once beside its waters I could head back along the beach and regain my boat. Down there I might dismiss my fears. The upper portion of the beach, if I mistook not, remained uncovered at the top of any ordinary tides, and it wanted yet a good 2 hours to high water, so that I had not the smallest doubt of being able to reach the creek head, no matter at what point of the foreshore I might descend. From the bank where I stood, I had a whole ridge in view above the dense foliage, and could select the most promising point to make for. But this would sink out of sight as I approached the first belt of trees, and beyond them I must find my way by guesswork. I now observed a sharp notch breaking the line of the ridge, about a mile to the westward, and walked some few hundred yards forward on the chance that it might widen as I drew more nearly abreast of it, and open into a passage between the hills. Widen it did, but very gradually, the stream curving away from it all the while, and by I halted again, in two minds whether to break straight across for it or continue this slow process of making sure. I had now reached a point where the tall cliff on the opposite shore either ended abruptly or took a sharp turn back from the stream. I could not determine which, and walked forward yet another 200 yards to satisfy myself. This brought me in view of a grove of palmettos clustering under the very lee of the rock, or so it appeared at first, but a second look told me that here the stream again divided, and that the new confluent swept by the base of the rock, between it and the palmettos, 3 or 4 of which, their roots may be sapped by bygone floods, leaned sideways, and almost hid the junction. I was turning away, resolved now to steer straight for the notch in the hills, when, for the second time, a gleam of something white arrested me, and I stood still, my heart in my mouth. The white object, whatever it was, stood within the circle of the palmetto stems, yet not very deep within it, a dozen yards at farthest from the stream's edge. I stared at it, and the longer I stared the more I was puzzled, until I plunged into the water and waded across for a closer look. Gaining the bank, I saw first that the white object was but one of many, disposed behind it in 2 rows as regular as the tree stems allowed. Next, that these objects were wooden boards, painted white, and with that, as I stepped towards the foremost, my foot slipped and I fell, twisting my ankle and narrowly saving myself from an ugly sprain. I had stumbled in a hollow, shallow depression between the mounds. Picking myself up, I saw that to the left and right, and all around me, the turf was ridged with similar mounds, the whole enclosure full of them. In a flash I read the meaning of the white painted boards. Yes, and there was writing on them, too, no words, but single letters and dates, roughly painted in black. O.M. 1796, R.A.S. 1796, P.D.V. and A.M.D.V. 1800. These and perhaps 20 of others. The shape of the mounds interpreted these inscriptions. I was in a graveyard. I sat helpless for a minute, dreadfully scanning the gloom through which the massed palmetto tops admitted but a shaft of light here and there. The flies, which had been a nuisance across the stream, here swarmed in myriads so thick that they seemed to hang in clusters from the boughs, and their incessant buzzing added to the horror of the place, a hint of something foul, sinister, almost obscene. I had a mind to creep away on all fours, but suddenly forgot my ankle and sprang erect, on the defensive, at the sound of voices. A grassy path led through the enclosure, between the graves, and at the end of it appeared 2 figures. They were 2 women, the first a negress, short, squat, and ugly, wearing a frock of the gaudiest yellow, and for head-dress a scarlet handkerchief bound closely about her scalp and tied in front with an immense bow. The other, but how shall I describe the other? She was white, and she wore a dress of fresh white muslin, a short dress, tied about the waist with a pale blue sash, and above the shoulders with narrow ribbons of the same color. Her figure was that of a girl. Her ringlets hung loose like a girl's. She walked with a girlish step, and until she came close I took her for a girl of 16 or 17. Then, with a shock, I found myself staring into the face which might well belong to a woman between 60 and 70, So faded it was and reticulated with wrinkles, and into a pair of eyes that wavered between ingenuousness and a childish cunning, and from them down to her slim ankles in a pair of dancing shoes, so fairy-like and diminutive that they seemed scarcely to press the grass underfoot. The pair had drawn to a halt, while I stood uncertain whether to brave them or make a bid for escape. I heard the negress cry aloud in a foreign tongue, at the same time flinging up her hands. But the other pushed past her and walked straight down upon me, albeit with a mincing, tripping motion, as if she was pacing a dance. Twice she spoke, and in two different languages, as I recognized, though able to make nothing of either, and then, halting before me, she tried for the third time in English. "Boy," she looked at me inquiringly, "what you do here? Will you tell?" "I come from the ship, ma'am," said I, finding my tongue. "The sheep? He bring a sheep? But why? And why he bring you?" I stared at her, not understanding. "Ma'am," said I, pointing over my shoulder, "we came here in a ship, a schooner, and she is lying in the creek yonder. I landed and climbed up through the woods. On my way I found this." I held out the paper boat. She caught it out of my hand with a sharp cry. But the black woman, at the same instant, turned on her and began to scold her volubly. The words were unintelligible to me, but her tone, full of angry remonstrance, could not be mistaken. "I am not sorry," said the white woman, speaking in English, with a glance at me. "No, I do not care for his orders. It was by this that you came to me?" she asked, turning to me again and pointing mincingly at the paper. "I found it in the stream," I replied, "almost a mile below this." "Yes, yes, you found it in the stream, and you opened it, and read the writing?" I shook my head. The writing, ma'am, was blotted. I could read nothing. "Not even my little song?" She peered into the paper, threw up her head and piped a note or two, for all the world as a bird chirrups, lifting his bill after taking a drink. "La, la, la, you did not understand, hey? But nevertheless you came, and of your own will. He did not bring you?" I shook my head again, having no clue to her meaning. "So best," she said, changing her tone of a sudden to one of extreme gravity. "For if he found you here, here of all places, he would kill you. Yes," she nodded impressively, "for sure he would kill you. He kill all these." She waved a hand, indicating the grave mounds. Her voice at these dreadful words ran up to an almost more dreadful airiness, and still she continued nodding, but now with a sort of simpering pride. "All these," she repeated, waving her hand again towards the mounds. "Did you see him kill them?" I asked, wondering whom he might be, and scarcely knowing what I said. "Some," she answered with a final nod, and a glance of extreme childish cunning. "But why you not talking, Rosa?" she demanded, turning on the negress. "You speak English. It is no use to pretend." The black woman stared at me for a moment from under her loose hanging lids. "You go 'way," she said slowly. "You get no good in these parts." "Very well, ma'am," said I, steadying my voice, "and the sooner the better, if you will kindly tell me the shortest cut back to the creek." "And," the woman went on, not seeming to heed the interruption, "you tell the same to your friends, that they get no good in these parts, but of us, and of this," she pointed to the sodden paper which she had snatched from her mistress's hands, "you will say nothing. It might bring mischief." "Mischief?" I echoed. "Mischief upon her." "But this is nonsense you talk, Rosa," broke in the little lady. "At the most, what have I written? A little song from Gluck, the divine Gluck." just a little song of Eurydice, calling to Orfeo. Ah, you should have heard me sing it in the days before my voice left me, in the opera boy, and the king himself, splitting his gloves to applaud us. But you are young, very young. I should not wonder to hear you were born after I left the stage. And you are pretty, but not old enough to be Orfeo yet. I must wait, though I wait till I doubt if I am not changed to Proserpine with her cracked voice. Boy, if I kissed you—" She advanced a step, but the negress caught her by the wrist violently, and at the same moment waving me off. I felt faint and giddy, as though some exhalation from the graveyard, not wholly repellent, but sickly, overpowering, like the scent of a hothouse lily, had been suddenly wafted under my nostrils. I fell back a pace as the negress motioned me away. Her hand pointed across the stream and across the meadow to the gap in the ridge. "Fast as you can run," she panted, "and never come this way again." The strong scent yet hung around me and seemed to bind me like a spell, pressing on my arms and legs. I plunged knee-deep into the stream. The cool touch of the water brought me back to my senses. I splashed across, waded up the bank, and set off running towards the gap. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Chapter 27 of Poison Island by Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. The Man in Black. Before ever I gained the gap, I was panting, and as I panted, the blood ran into my mouth from a deep scratch across the eyebrows. I tasted it as I ran. My shirt hung in strips, and one stocking flapped open on a rip from knee to ankle. But on the farther side of the ridge I ran no longer. I flung myself and fell through the matted ferns that, veiling the trough of a half-dry watercourse, now checked my descent as I clutched at them, now parted and let me drop and bruise myself on the rocky bottom. In the end I found myself on the soft sand beside the blessed water of the creek, bloodied indeed, for I had taken a shrewd knock on the bridge of the nose. But with a wrenched shoulder and a jarred knee panned for the worst of my hurts. I valued them, nothing in comparison with the terrors left behind in the woods. The schooner lay in sight, scarcely half a mile below, and I sobbed with gratitude as I dipped my face in the tide and washed off its bloodstains. The tide was still at flood, and wanted, as I guess, less than an hour of high water, but it left an almost continuous stretch of sand between me and the creek head, and I found that the short intervals where it narrowed to nothing could be waded with ease. At first the curve of the foreshore and the overhanging woods concealed the spit of beach where I had made fast my punt beside the dinghy. But at the corner which brought the boats in sight, I was aware of two figures standing beside them, Captain Branscombe and Mr. Rogers. I walked forward hardily enough. I had drunk my fill of terror, and could have faced the captain had he been thrice as formidable. He did not help me at all, but stood with a thunderous frown, very quiet and self-restrained, while I plodded my way up to him over the sand. I think that, as I drew close, my battered appearance must have shocked him a little, but his frown did not relax, and the muscles of his mouth grew, if anything, tenser. "You appear to have been in the wars," he said quietly. "Has anything happened to the schooner?" "No, sir, at least not to my knowledge," was my answer, and he must have expected it, or he would have shown more perturbation. "I saw her not 5 minutes ago lying at her moorings," I added, with a nod towards the bend of the creek which hid her from us. "Then why has Miss Belcher sent you?" "She did not send me, sir." In other words, you have chosen to disobey orders? I suppose he read some sullenness in my attitude, for he repeated the word sharply, in a tone that demanded an answer. I am sorry, sir, but all the same it didn't seem fair to me to be left on board without being consulted. I heard him take a short breath, as though my impudence him in the wind. For a full half a minute eyed me slowly up and down. Get into your boat, sir, and return to the ship at once. Mr. Rogers, this child is impossible. I must do what I would gladly have avoided, and ask the ladies to give me more authority over him, since they will not exercise it themselves. At the implied sneer, and perhaps even more at the tone of it, so foreign to the Captain Branscome that I knew, I blazed up wrathfully. If you mean by that, said I, to threaten me with the rope's end, I advise you to try it. And if you mean that I'm child enough to be tied to apron strings of a couple of women, that's just of a piece with the whole mistake you're making. No one's disputing your right to give orders. Thank you, he put in sarcastically. To those, I went on, who appointed you captain. But I wasn't consulted, and until that happens, I shall obey or not as I choose. Now this, no doubt, was extremely childish, even wickedly foolish, and the more foolish, perhaps, because a few minutes ago I would have given all I possessed, including my prospective share in the treasure, for Captain Branscome's protection. But somehow, since sighting the island, I had lost hold of myself, and my temper seemed to be running all askew. Strange to tell, the captain appeared to be affected in much the same way. "Why, you little fool," said he, "are you mistaking this for a picnic?" "No," I retorted, "I am not. And if you'll remember, it wasn't I who led the ladies to look forward to one." He planted himself before me, and said he, looking at me sternly, "See here, my boy, I don't want to make unpleasantness, and if you force me to appeal to the whole ship's company, you know very well you will find yourself in a minority of one." "I don't care for that, sir. You'll be acting unfairly all the same." "We'll let that pass. You tell here in the act of breaking ship that you are of an age to be consulted. Well, you shall have the benefit of the doubt. You want to know, then, why I am careful about letting you run ashore? What would you say if I told you the island has people upon it?" "Why, first of all, sir, that if you found it out before dropping anchor, it seems strange your going ashore with Mr. Rogers and leaving the rest to take care of themselves. But if you've discovered it since—" "I have not. I am not sure the island is inhabited, but as we were running down the coast, I saw something through my glasses, a coil of smoke beyond the hills on the eastern side. Now, if, as seems certain, this fire was lit by human beings, it almost stands to reason they must have sighted our ship. Next comes the question, why did I go ashore and take Mr. Rogers? Well, in the first place, we didn't come here to lie at anchor and sail away again, and if the island happened to be inhabited, and by people who don't want us, why, then the sooner we nipped ashore and prospected, the better. For the spot where I sighted the smoke must lie a good 5 miles from here as the crow flies, and by the shape of the hills and the amount of scrub between 'em, those 5 miles must be equal to 15. But why, say you, did I take Mr. Rogers? I took Mr. Rogers after consulting with Miss Belcher." "Does she know there are people on the island?" "She does. I took Mr. Rogers because, if danger there be, it seemed likelier we should find it ashore than on board the schooner, and because, as the shortest way to make sure if these strangers were after our treasure, we had agreed to make straight for the clump of trees described on the back of the chart, and examine whether the ground thereabouts had been visited lately or disturbed. And, further, because our search might require more strength and agility than I alone, with my lame leg, could command, I felt pretty easy about the schooner. She can only be attacked by boat, and I searched the coast pretty narrowly on our way down without sighting one. If these men possess a boat, she probably lies somewhere on the eastern side, not far from their campfire. If she lies nearer, it must be somewhere under the cliffs to the south, in which case her owners would have a long journey to reach her, and that journey must take them around the head of the creek here. But, say you, there may be two parties on the island, one by the campfire northward, and another under the south shore. I'll grant this, though I think it unlikely, but even so, to attack the schooner, they must bring their boat up the whole length of the entrance, where our people would have her in view for at least 2 miles. This would give ample time for a signal to recall us, and on the chance of it, I left Goodfellow in charge of 2 rockets, with instructions to touch them off on a hint of danger. Oh, said I. So Mr. Goodfellow, too, knew of this? And Pliny, I suppose? And in fact, you told everyone but me? No, sir, said Captain Branscombe gravely. I did not trouble Miss Plinlimmon with these perhaps unnecessary fears. To a lady of her sensitive nature— Oh, well, sir, I interrupted, and turning aside pettishly, began to haul my cockboat down to the water. Since you choose to treat me like a baby of 6, I suppose it's no wonder you take Pliny for a timorous old fool. Sir, exploded Captain Branscombe, and glancing back over my shoulder, I saw him leaning on his stick and fairly trembling with wrath. This disrespectful language, and of a lady for whom... Disrespect? I whistled. Is it worse to speak disrespect or to act it? I have known Pliny for years, you for a month or 2, and one of these days, if this expedition gets into a mess, as it likely will with such handling, that sensitive lady will make you see stars. I knew, while I uttered it, that my speech was abominably ill-conditioned, that Captain Branscombe had, in fact, been holding out the olive branch, and that, in common decency, I ought to have caught at it. In short, I felt my boyish temper going from bad to worse, and yet, somehow, that I could not apply the brake to it. "Why, confound the boy!" ejaculated Mr. Rogers. "Whatever bee has stung him?" And gripping me by the shoulder, as I heaved at the boat, he swung me round to face him. "Look here, young Harry Brooks, do you happen to be sickening for something, that you talk like a gutter-snipe to a gentleman old enough to be your grandfather? Or, damn, have you and Goodfellow been coming to blows? By the nose of you, and the state of your shirt, a man would say you've come from a street fight, and by your talk, that your head was knocked silly." "It's all very well, Mr. Rogers," said I sulkily, "and I know I oughtn't to have spoken like that, but I hate to be tyrannized over. That's why I didn't take your warning first along and pull back to the ship, though I thank you for it all the same." "Hey?" said Mr. Rogers. "My warning? What in thunder is the boy talking about?" "When you saw me sculling for shore, here, about an hour ago," I explained, "you pretended not to see me, and went after Captain Branscombe, but I saw you, fast enough, standing on the bank yonder, under the trees." "For a certainty, the child is mad." Mr. Rogers stared at me round-eyed. "I saw you? I pretended not to? Why, man alive, from the time we left the ship, I never set eyes on you. How should I? Nor even guessed you were ashore till we came back and found your boat beside the dinghy. And as for standing under those trees, I was never on the bank there for 1 second, no, nor for the half of one. The captain and I walked around the spit together. The tide has covered our footmarks, or I could show them to you." "At any rate, there was a man," I persisted, "and he couldn't have been the captain either, for he was wearing dark clothes." "The devil I say! Branscombe, listen to this." "I am listening," answered the captain gravely, taking, as he stepped forward, a long look at the bank above us, and at the dense forest to the right and left. "Did you see the man's face, Harry?" "No, sir, or I should not have mistaken him for Mr. Rogers. He was standing there, under the boughs, and seemed to be looking through them and watching me. I was sculling the boat along with the paddle, slipped in the stern notch, and he let me come pretty close. I couldn't have been 200 yards away. when he slipped to the back of the trees, and I lost him." "You didn't see him again?" "No, sir. I didn't land just at once. I had a mind at first to put about and row to the schooner, thinking that Mr. Rogers had meant it for a hint. When I brought the boat ashore, 5 minutes later, he was gone." "Which way did you take, then?" "I went straight after you, sir, up the waterfalls, but couldn't find any trace of you, except at one spot just beside a waterfall. The fourth. It was where someone had slipped a foot."
"Mr. Rogers," the captain interrupted, "we had best get back to the Espriella with all speed. I may tell you, Harry, that we never went up by the waterfalls at all. It was a climb, and my half-pay leg didn't like the look of it. But jump into your boat, boy, and pull ahead of us. You and I must do a little serious talking later on." We pulled back briskly for the Espriella, and reached her just as she began to swing with the turn of the tide. As we drew close, the cockboat leading, I glanced over my shoulder and spied Pliny leaning against the bulwarks by the starboard quarter, in the attitude of one gently enjoying the sunset scene. But at the sight of my torn shirt, all her composure left her, and she came running to the accommodation ladder, where she met me with a string of agitated questions. "Excuse me, ma'am,"
said Captain Branscome, as the dinghy fell alongside and he climbed on deck.
"I have no wish to alarm you, and indeed there may be no cause at all for alarm, but Harry has brought us some serious news. He reports that there is a man, a stranger, on the island."
"How could Harry have known?" was Pliny's unexpected response.
"He is confident that he saw a man somewhat more than an hour since, standing at the head of the creek."
"Now that is very curious," said Pliny, "for the gentleman told me he had borrowed Harry's boat without being observed."
I beg your pardon, ma'am?"
Captain Branscome stared about him.
"A gentleman, did you say?"
"Yes, and such distinguished manners. He left a message for you, and, dear me, you should have heard how he praised my coffee." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 28. The Master of the Island. But here, as Captain Branscome leaned back and caught feebly at the main rigging for support, there appeared above the after companion, like a cognizance above an escutcheon, a bent forearm, the hand grasping a beaver hat. It was presently followed by the head of Miss Belcher, who nodded cheerfully, blinking a little in the level light of the sunset. "Hello," she said, addressing Pliny, while she adjusted the hat upon her brow. "Have you been telling the captain about our visitor?"
"Miss Plinlimmon, ma'am, has given me a shock, and I won't deny it," answered the captain, recovering himself.
Miss Belcher continued to nod like a China mandarin. "I don't wonder," she agreed. "For my part, you might have knocked me down with a feather. The fellow came down the creek, cool as you please, and pulling a nice easy stroke in Harry's cockboat. Where is Harry, by the way?" Her eyes lit and fastened upon me. "Good Lord, what have you been doing to the child?"
"Nothing, ma'am. He has been exploring and lost his way, that's all."
He seems to have lost it pretty badly. Well, he deserved it. But as I was saying, along comes my gentleman, pulling with just the easy jerk which is the way to make the boat of that sort travel. Goodfellow was keeping watch. They say that a sailor will recognize a boat half a mile further off than he'll recognize the man in it. But Goodfellow isn't a sailor, so that explanation won't fit. We'll say that he was prepared for the boat returning, but not to find an entire stranger pulling her. At all events, he let her come within a couple of gunshots before calling down to the cabin and giving the alarm. I had my legs up on a locker and was taking a siesta over a book, Parkinson on the dog. And by the way, we were a set of fools not to bring a dog. But I ran up the companion in a jiffy, and had the sense to catch up your spyglass as I went.
Goodfellow by this time had begun to dance about the deck in a flutter. He had the tinder box in his hand and wanted to know if he should touch off a rocket. I ordered him to drop it and fetch me a musket, which he did. By this time I could see that the man in the boat was unarmed, so I put up the musket at the present, got the sight on him, and called out to know his business. The man jerked the cockboat round with her stern to the schooner. These boats come right about with a single twist. And says he, very politely lifting his hat, "You'll pardon me, ma'am, but as you see I have borrowed your young friend's boat. My own was not handy, and this seemed the quickest way to pay my respects." "Indeed," said I, "and who might you be?" "My name, ma'am," said he, "is Beauregard, Dr. Beauregard." "I've never heard of you," said I. "That, ma'am, is entirely my misfortune," said he, lifting his hat again. "But allow me to say that I am the proprietor of this island, and very much at your service." Well, this was a facer. It never occurred to any of us, that this island might have an owner. To tell the truth, I am a stickler for the rights of property at home. But somehow the notion of an island like this belonging to anyone had never entered my head. Yet the thing is reasonable enough when you come to think it over. And, of course, I saw that it put an entirely different complexion upon our business here. "My dear Lydia," put in Mr. Rogers impatiently, "the man's claims must be absurd. Why, the island is right in the tropics." "You wouldn't have thought it a bit absurd if you had heard him," retorted Miss Belcher. "He appeared to be quite sure of his ground. Very pleasant about it, too, he was. Said that few visitors ever honoured his out-of-the-way home, but that as soon as any arrived, he always made it a matter of punctilio, yes, that was the word, to put off and bid them welcome. He spoke with the slightest possible foreign accent, but used admirable English. And I don't know why," wound up Miss Belcher ingenuously, "but he seemed to divine from the first that I was an Englishwoman. And it wasn't as if we had come here flaunting British colours," added Pliny. "But what sort of man was he?" asked the captain. "Height 6'2" or 3" in his stockings, age about 60, face clean-shaven and fleshy, the features extraordinarily powerful, hair jet black and dyed, if at all, by a process that would make his fortune if he sold the secret. Clothes black alpaca and well cut, with silk stockings that would be cheap at 2 guineas, and shoes with gold buckles on them. I couldn't take my eyes off, no display about them, and yet I doubt if King Louis of France ever wore the like before they cut his head off. Complexion pale for this climate, with a sort of silvery shine about it. Manner charming, voice charming, bearing fit for a grand signor. And that's what he is, or something like it, unless, as I rather incline to suspect, he's the biggest scoundrel unhung." "Oh, Miss Belcher," protested Pliny, "when you agreed with me that he might have sat for a portrait of a gentleman of the old school." "Tut, my dear, when I saw that you had lost your heart to him as soon as he set foot on deck, did I say of the old school?" "Yes, indeed. And of the very oldest, and in fact quite possibly the old gentleman himself." Now either I had spoiled Captain Branscome's temper for the day, or something in this speech of Miss Belcher's especially rasped it. "But who is this man?" he demanded in a sharp authoritative voice. Miss Belcher stepped back half a pace. I saw her chin go up, and it seemed to grow square as she answered him with a dangerous coldness. "I beg your pardon. I thought I told you that he gave his name as Dr. Beauregard." "You had no business, ma'am, to allow him on board the ship." "No business?" "No business, ma'am. I have just been having words with young Harry here over his disobedience this afternoon, but this is infinitely more serious. We are here to search for treasure. We no sooner drop anchor than a man visits us who claims that the island is his. This at once presupposes his claim upon any treasure that may be hidden upon it, and consequently that, as soon as he discovers our purpose, he will be our enemy. It follows, I should imagine, that of all steps the most fatal was to admit him on board to discover our weakness."
"Our weakness, sir?" asked Miss Belcher, carelessly, as though but half attending.
"Our weakness, ma'am, as it was doubtless to discover our weakness that he came."
"Now, I rather thought," murmured Miss Belcher, "that Miss Plinlimmon and I had spent a great part of this afternoon in impressing him with our strength."
"To be sure," pursued Captain Branscome. "But with such a company as he found on board, he can scarcely have suspected a treasure hunt. Still, when he does suspect it, as sooner or later he must, he will know our weakness."
"He could scarcely have dealt with us more frankly than he did, at any rate," said Miss Belcher, with an air of simplicity, "for he assured us he was alone on the island."
"And you believed him, ma'am?"
"I forget, sir, if I believed him, but he certainly knows that we are here in search of treasure, for I told him so myself." Captain Branscome gasped.
"You? You told him so?"
he echoed. "I did, and he replied that it scarcely surprised him to hear it, that of the few vessels which found their way to Mortallone, quite an appreciable proportion came from some idea of discovering treasure. The proportion, he added, had fallen off of late years, and the most of them nowadays put into water. But there was a time when the treasure-seekers threatened to become a positive nuisance. He said this with a smile which disarmed all suspicion. In fact, it was impossible to take offence with the man." But at this point, Pliny, frightened perhaps at the warnings of apoplexy in Captain Branscome's face, laid a hand gently on Miss Belcher's arm. "Are we treating our good friend quite fairly?" she asked. Miss Belcher glanced at her and broke into a ringing laugh. "You dear creature! No, to be sure we are not. But from a child I always turned mischievous under correction. Captain Branscome, I beg your pardon."
"It is granted, ma'am."
"And, for I take you to be on the point of resigning here and now."
"Ma'am, you have guessed correctly."
"I am going to beg you to do nothing of the sort. No, I am not going to ask it only as a favour, but to appeal to your reason. You think it extremely rash of me to have entertained this man and talked with him so frankly? Well, but consider. To begin with, if I had not told him that we were after the treasure, he would probably have guessed it. Nay, I make bold to say that he guessed it already, for I forgot to mention it. He knows Harry Brooks." "Knows me, ma'am?" I cried out, as all the company turned and stared at me. "He says so, and that he recognized you as you were sculling up the creek." "Knows me?" I echoed. "But who on earth can he be, then? Not the man Aaron Glass, surely?" "I was wondering," said Miss Belcher. But Aaron Glass wasn't a bit like this man, as you made him out. A thin, foxy-looking fellow with sandy hair and a face full of wrinkles, about the middling height, with sloping shoulders. Then he can't be Aaron Glass. But whoever he is, he knows you. That's the important point, and pretty certainly connects you with the treasure. He didn't seem to have met Goodfellow before. Well, now, if he lives alone here, which I admit is not likely, we ought to be more than a match for him. If, on the other hand, he has men at his call, and I ask your particular attention here, Captain, it was surely no folly at all, but the plainest common sense to admit him on board. He will go off and report that our ship's company consists of 2 middle-aged maiden ladies. I occupied myself with tatting a chair cover while he conversed. A boy, Mr. Goodfellow, whatever he may have made of Goodfellow, and 2 gentlemen ashore to whose mental and physical powers I was careful to do some injustice. You will pardon me, Captain, but I laid more than warrantable stress on your lameness. And as for you, Jack, I depicted you as a mere country booby." Here Mr. Rogers bowed amiably. And added by way of confirmation that I had known you from childhood. He will go back and report all this, with a certain consequence that he and his confederates will mistake us for a crew of crack-brained eccentrics." When she had done, the captain stood considering for a moment, rubbing his chin.
"Yes," he admitted slowly. "There seems reason in that, ma'am. Reason and method. But 'tis a kind of reason and method outside all my experience, and you must excuse me if I get the grip of it slowly. I should like a good look at the man before saying more."
"As to that," answered Miss Belcher, "you won't have long to wait for it. He has invited us all ashore tomorrow for a picnic. He charged me to say, if he did not happen to run against you as he was returning the cockboat, that he would be at the creek head punctually at 9:30 to await us." 2 hours later, Captain Branscome sent word for me to attend him in his cabin.
"I want to tell you, Harry Brooks," said the old man, turning away from me while he lit his pipe, "that I've been thinking over what happened this afternoon."
"I was in the wrong, sir."
"You were, and I am glad to hear you acknowledge it. Now, what I want to say is this. Had affairs gone in the least as I expected, I should have held you to strict service, as we used to say on the old packets. I never tolerated a favourite on board, and never shall. But these ladies don't make a favourite of you. That's not the trouble. The trouble, no, I won't call it even that, is that you and they all cannot help taking the bit between your teeth. It don't appear to be your fault. You wasn't bred to the sea, and can't tumble into sea fashions. So much the worse, a man might say. The plague of it is, I can't be sure, and after casting it up and down, I've determined to let you have your way."
"You don't mean, sir, that you're going to resign?" said I, confounded.
"No, I don't. Saving your objections, boy, I was elected captain, and it don't do away with my responsibility that I choose to let discipline go to the winds. If mischief comes, I shall be to blame, because I might have stopped it, but didn't."
I was silent. This should have been the time for me to tell what I had discovered that afternoon, of the graveyard and the 2 strange women. But shame tied my tongue. I saw that this noble gentleman, in imparting his thoughts to me, was really condescending to ask my pardon, and the injustice of it was so monstrous that I felt a delicacy in letting him know the extent of my unworthiness. I temporized and promised myself a better occasion. "But are you quite sure, sir, that yours was not the wisest plan after all?"
"The question is not worth considering," he answered. "My policy, you would hardly call it a plan, for it wholly depends on circumstances, no longer exists. The ladies, you see, have forced my hand."
I forbore to tell him that if the ladies had forced his hand, his accepting full responsibility was simply quixotic. "She's a wonderful woman," said I, by way of filling up the pause.
"And so womanly,"
assented Captain Branscome, to my entire surprise. "Indeed, sir," I stammered. "Well, I have heard people say, Mr. Rogers for one, that Miss Belcher ought to have been born a man."
"Miss Belcher? Why, heavens alive, boy, I was referring to Miss Plinlimmon."
He dismissed me with a wave of the hand, but called me back as I turned to the door.
"Oh, by the way," said he, "I had almost forgotten the reason why I sent for you. This man, have you any notion who he can be?"
"None, sir."
"You've thought over every possible person of your acquaintance?" "Well," as I nodded, "we shall know tomorrow morning if he keeps his word. Mr. Rogers has kindly undertaken to stay and look after the schooner. He has a sense of discipline, by the way, has Mr. Rogers."
"If you wish me, sir, to stay with him—"
"Thank you," he interrupted dryly. but we shall need you ashore. In the first place, to identify this mysterious stranger, and also to help protect the ladies. Their escort, heaven knows, is not excessive. We take the gig, and if the man fails to appear, or brings even so much as one companion, I give the word to return. But these apprehensions proved to be groundless. As we rowed around the bend next morning into view of the creek head, the man stood there alone, awaiting us. He saw us at once, and lifted his hat in welcome. "Do you know him, Harry?" asked Miss Belcher. "No," said I, pretty confidently, and then, "But yes, in the garden that evening, the day you went up to Plymouth for the sale." "Eh? The garden at Minden Cottage? What on earth was he doing there?" "Nothing, ma'am. At least, I don't know. He seemed to be taking measurements, and he gave me a guinea. I rather think, ma'am, he was the man that attended the auction." "You never saw him until that evening?" "No." "Nor afterwards?" "Only that once, ma'am." "Oh," said Miss Belcher. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 29. A Boat on the Beach. As we drew to shore, the stranger stepped down the beach and lifted his hat again. "Welcome, ladies, and let me thank you and all your party for this confidence. The boy here, bless my soul, how he has grown in these few months. The boy and I have had the pleasure of meeting before. Eh, Harry Brooks? You remember me. To the captain I must introduce myself. Shake hands, Captain Branscome. I am proud to make your acquaintance. But what is the meaning of these baskets? You have brought your own provisions? Come, Miss Belcher, that is unkind of you when we agreed, yes, surely we agreed, that you were to be my guests." "We were not sure, sir," began Miss Belcher, "that I should keep my word. Worse and worse. Or possibly you distrusted the entertainment of a solitary bachelor on a desert island? But I must prove that you did me an injustice." He pointed to a goodly hamper on the beach, and to a frail or carpenter's basket, from which half a dozen bottles protruded their necks, topped with red and green seals. "As proprietor of Mortallone, you will forgive my laying stress on it. I may surely claim the right to do the honours. Stay a moment, my good man," he added, as Mr. Goodfellow made a motion to lift out our own hamper. "Miss Plinlimmon, I believe, is an admirer of natural scenery, and if the ladies will step ashore for a few minutes, there is a waterfall above which may reward her inspection. Not by any means, ma'am, the grandest our island can show, yet charming in its way, and distant but a short 5 minutes' walk. Captain Branscome will bear me out, and Harry too. Yes, Harry too, if I mistake not, visited it yesterday." He put out a hand to assist the ladies to disembark, at the same time hitching back the gun on his bandolier. "You will excuse my having brought a musket. You have brought your own, I see. Quite right. I carry it habitually, for, to tell you the truth, the island contains a few wild boars, who dispute possession with me. A very few. We are not likely to meet with one, so the ladies may reassure themselves. But, as I was about to say, with the captain's permission, we will not unload here. Rather, after visiting the waterfall, I would suggest that we row round to the eastern side, where, if I may guide you, you will find choice of a dozen delightful spots for a picnic. In this way, too, we shall cover more ground, and get a more general view of the beauties of the island, which, as I dare say my friend Harry discovered yesterday, is somewhat too thickly overgrown for easy travelling." The man's manner, at once frank, chatty, and easily polite, completely disconcerted me, and I could see it disconcerted the captain. It seemed to reduce the whole expedition to an ordinary picnic. And, more astonishing yet, the ladies accepted it for that. They fell in, one on each side of him, as he led the way to the waterfall, and for a climax Miss Belcher shook out a parasol which she had been carrying under her arm and spread it above her beaver hat. At the waterfall our host surpassed himself. The landscape hereabouts, he declared, always reminded him of Nicholas Poussin. He would like Miss Plinlimmon's opinion on the rock drawing of Salvator Rosa, a painter whom he gently depreciated. Had Miss Plinlimmon ever visited the Apennines? He plucked a few of the ferns growing in the spray and discoursed on them, comparing them with the common European polypody. He turned to music, and challenged his fair visitors to guess the note made by the falling water. It hummed on E natural, rising now and then by something less than a semitone. With all this, it was not easy to suspect him of acting, as it was next to impossible to mistake him for a trifler. His tall figure, his carriage, the fine pose of his head, his resonant manly voice, all forbade it, no less than did the wild scenery to which he drew our attention with an easy proprietary wave of the hand. I observed that Captain Branscome listened to him with a puzzled frown. The waterfall having been duly admired, we retraced our steps to the shore. The gig carried a small mast and lug sail, and the faint wind blowing fair down the creek, the captain suggested our hoisting them. I think it annoyed him to find himself appealing to Dr. Beauregard. "By all means," said the doctor affably. "It will save labour till we reach open water, when I will ask you to lower them. We had best use the paddles after rounding the point to eastward, and keep close inshore. I have my reasons for recommending this, reasons which I shall be happy to explain to you, sir, at the proper time." Here he bowed to Captain Branscome. Accordingly we hoisted sail, and in a few minutes opened the view of the lower reach, with the Espriella swinging softly at her cables, her masts reflected on the scarcely rippled water. Miss Belcher broke into a laugh at sight of Mr. Rogers wistfully eyeing us from the deck. Dr. Beauregard echoed it, just audibly. "Well, well, ma'am, it is hard upon Mr. Rogers, did you tell me? But we must not blame the captain for taking precautions. A very neat craft, captain, and Jamaica built by the look of her." "We picked her up at Savannah la Mar," announced Miss Belcher. "After burning your boats, madame? Pardon me, but I find your frankness as admirable as it is unexpected. Moreover, though Captain Branscome deprecates it, no policy could be wiser." "I see no reason, sir, for being less than candid with you," said Miss Belcher. "You know whence we come, and you know why we are here. How we came is a trifling matter in comparison." "Believe me, ma'am, your frankness is all in your favour. I may repeat what I told you yesterday, that several expeditions have come to this island seeking treasure, crews of merely avaricious men, mad with greed, whom I have made it my business to baffle. You, on the contrary, may almost count on my help, though whether the treasure will do you much good when you have found it is another question altogether. But we are not treasure-seeking just now, and I shall grudge even the pleasure of talking if it steal your admiration from my island." The shore by which we steered was indeed entrancing, and grew yet more entrancing as we rounded Cape Fea, and, downing sail, headed the gig for the northeast, pulling almost in the shadow of the cliffs, for the sea lay calm as a pond, and broke in feeblest ripples even on the beaches recessed here and there in the chasms. We passed Try Again Inlet, and our wonder grew, for the cliffs now were mere cliffs no longer, but the bases of a range of mountains, broken into rock slides with matted vines, like curtains overhanging their scars. And in the water, 10 fathoms deep below us, we could watch the coloured fishes at play. Mr. Goodfellow and I were at the oars, and we had been pulling, as I judged, for something over an hour, but easily, for the tide could hardly be felt, when Dr. Beauregard, who had taken the tiller, steered us in toward a beach, which he announced to be the, perhaps, very choicest in the island for a picnic. Certainly, it was a fairy-like spot, with white sand underfoot, green creepers overhanging, and through the creepers a rill of water splashing down the cliff. Yet we had passed at least a dozen other beaches, which to me had looked no less inviting. "We will leave the ladies to unpack the hampers," said Dr. Beauregard. "I speak as a bachelor, but in my experience there is a half-hour before lunch, in which that man is best appreciated who makes himself scarce. Captain Branscome, if you will not mind a short scramble over the rocks here, to the left, I can promise you something worth seeing." He led the way at once, and we followed, the captain, who appeared to have lost his temper again, growling that he took no stock in views. But the distance was not far. We scrambled over 2 low ledges of rock, and found ourselves looking down upon a beach even prettier and more fairy-like than the one we had left, and upon something more, a ship's boat, drawn about 30 feet above high water, and resting there on her side. "Yours?" asked Captain Branscome, after a long stare at her. "Certainly not," answered Dr. Beauregard, "and that is why I brought you here." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 30. The Scream on the Cliff. "A boat?" said Captain Branscome, staring again, and slowly rubbing the back of his head. He took a step forward to descend to the beach and examine her, but Dr. Beauregard laid a hand on his arm. "Not so fast, my friend. Qui dit cano dit canutir. A glance will assure you that she did not beach herself in that position, above high water mark, still less furl her own sail and stow it. Further, if you study the country behind us, you will see that, while we came unobserved and stand at this moment in excellent cover, by crossing the beach we expose ourselves to observation and the risk of a bullet." "I take it, sir," answered Captain Branscome, still puzzled, "you knew this boat to be here, and have brought us with some purpose." "I knew it, to be sure, and my purpose is simple. We cannot have a rival party of treasure-seekers on the island. We have ladies in our charge, gentle, well-bred ladies, and of the crew of that boat, one man, to my knowledge, is a pretty desperate ruffian. The other 2— You have seen them, then?" Dr. Beauregard lifted his shoulders slightly and took snuff. "My good friend," he answered, "as Lord Proprietor of Mortallone, I pay attention to all my visitors. Well, as I was saying, to cross the beach just now would be venturesome and foolish to boot, seeing that we hold all the cards and have only to wait." "What of the ladies?" asked the captain. "We can return at once and join them at luncheon. But the ladies, as you remind me, complicate the affair. Before you arrived, I had laid my plans to let these rascals have the run of the island and amuse me by their activities. I had, in fact, prepared a little deception for them. Oh, a very innocent little trick. I don't know, my dear sir, if it has struck you how much simpler our amusements tend to become as we grow older. I had promised myself to watch them, lying perdu, and in the end to dismiss them with a quiet chuckle. You have read your Tempest, Captain Branscome. Well, I have no obedient Ariel to play will-o'-the-wisp with such gentry, yet I would have led them a very pretty dance. But the ladies, to be sure, we cannot expose them to dangers, nor even to alarms. We must use more summary methods." He stood for a moment or two reflective, tapping his snuff-box. "Mr. Goodfellow is a carpenter, I understand." "At your service, sir." Mr. Goodfellow's hand went half-way to his waistcoat pocket, as if to produce his business card. "I seem to remember, Mr. Goodfellow, that you carry a bag of tools in the boat." "Yes, sir." "Including, no doubt, an auger, or, at any rate, a fair-sized gimlet?" "Both, sir." "You will greatly oblige me, then, Mr. Goodfellow, always with Captain Branscome's leave, by returning to the boat and fetching your auger, if possible without attracting the ladies' observation. With this, instead of returning direct to us, you will make your way to the left, towards the head of the beach, keeping well under the rocks, which will serve you from landward. At the head of the beach you will bring us into sight a pace or two before you come abreast of the boat. There, at a signal from me, you will creep down to the boat, on hands and knees, or on your stomach if you will, and bore me 3 small holes close alongside her keelson, using as much expedition as may consist with neatness. You understand? Then the quicker you set about it, the less will be the risk." Mr. Goodfellow touched his forelock and sped on his errand. Dr. Beauregard seated himself on the rocks, and, loosing the gun from his bandolier, laid it across his knees. "A simple job," he remarked. "Any one of us could do it as well as Goodfellow. But it is a practice of mine to take the smallest risks into account, and if the honest fellow should be detected, why, I imagine he can be most easily spared of the party." Mr. Goodfellow, however, reached the boat without misadventure. "Ah, he displays intelligence," commented Dr. Beauregard, watching him as, before setting to work, he lifted the boat's gunwale and heaved her over on her other side, exposing the bilge piece on which she had been resting. "Yes, decidedly, he displays intelligence." Mr. Goodfellow, having stripped off his coat, picked up his auger and bored his 3 holes very neatly. This done, he rubbed them over with a handful of sand, and smoothed over with sand all traces of sawdust, heaved the boat back, so that she rested again in her original position, and retired, sweeping his coat behind him, and obliterating his footprints as he went. "Couldn't be bettered," said Dr. Beauregard, smiling cheerfully, and smoothing his gun barrel. "And now I think we may rejoin the ladies, and pray that these rascals will put off disturbing us until after luncheon. At one time I feared they might have taken a panic yesterday morning at sight of your schooner, but they calculated, maybe, that the chances were all against your discovering their presence, which, of course, you never suspected." "I suspected something fast enough," said Captain Branscome, "for in running along the coast I caught sight of smoke rising among the hills, from a camp fire, as I reckoned, and no doubt from here or hereabouts, though I should have put it a mile or 2 further south." "The born fools," said Dr. Beauregard, laughing. "Well, it's even possible that in their furious preoccupation they let the schooner come close without spying her. Ah, Captain, you can hardly imagine, you, fresh from a civilized country, where folks must keep up appearances, while they prey upon one another, how this lust of gold brutalizes a man when, as here, he pursues it without restraint. And what, after all, will gold purchase? Not happiness, I verily believe," said the captain, "though to the poor, and I speak as one who has been bitterly poor, it may bring happiness for a while, in the shape of relief from grinding discomfort." "Yes, yes, as pleasure lies in mere cessation from pain. But that does not meet my question. We will take Master Harry here, who seems a good, ordinary, healthy boy. We will suppose him in possession of the treasure you are here to seek. What in the end can he purchase with it better than the fun he is getting out of this expedition? He can indulge all his senses, but for a while only. In the end, indulgence brings satiety, dulls the appetite, takes the savor from the feast, and so destroys itself. He can purchase power, you say? But that again moves one difficulty but a step further. For what will his power give him when he has won it? These are questions, Captain, which I have asked myself daily here on this island. I have been asking them ever since, and while I was yet a young man, they came to wear for me a personal application. Vanity of vanities, Captain, What the preacher discovered long ago, I discovered again, and of my own experience." "The Christian religion, sir," began Captain Branscome. But here our strange host laid a hand on his arm. "We forget our politeness," he interrupted, yet gently, and without suspicion of offence. "We keep the ladies waiting." "Captain Branscome and I," said our host, as he seated himself beside Miss Belcher and uncorked one of the green-sealed bottles, "have been talking platitudes, to which, however, our present business lends a certain fresh interest. You are here, many thousands of miles from home, on a hunt for treasure. Now, heaven forbid that I should criticize your intentions, seeing that incidentally I am in debt to them for this delightful picnic. But before I help you, as believe me, I am disposed to help, may I ask what you propose to do with this wealth when you get it?" "Why, sir," answered Miss Belcher, candidly, "we discussed that, you may be sure, before starting. The bulk of it, after paying expenses, was to go to young Brooks here. Circumstances had given him, as we supposed, and for the matter of that, as we still believe, the clue to the treasure." "Pardon me, ma'am, for interrupting you, but did that clue take the form of a map of the island?" "It did, sir." "A map with 3 red crosses upon it, and some writing on the back? Nay, I will not press the question. Your faces answer it. I ought to tell you, Dr. Beauregard, in justice to the boy, that he came by it honestly, though in very tragic circumstances." "Again, ma'am, your faces would answer for the honesty of your business. As for the circumstances you speak of, it may save time if I tell you that I know the whole story. Why, truly," he went on as we stared, "there is no mystery about it. I dare say, ma'am, the boy has found an opportunity to whisper to you that he and I have met before. It was at Minden Cottage, in his father's garden, and by the very spot where his father was murdered. He found me there, taking measurements, for I had a theory about the crime, a theory of which I need only say here that, though right in the main, it missed certain details, of which Harry's engaging conversation put me on the scent. I had read of the murder quite accidentally, but it happened that I knew something of Coffin, enough to explain his fate, and of the man who had murdered him. But of Major Brooks I knew nothing, and what I gathered by inquiry made the whole affair more and more puzzling. At length I hit on the explanation that Coffin, who had reasons, and strong ones, for going in deadly terror of Aaron Glass, had in some way chosen this Major Brooks for his confessor, and journeyed to Minden Cottage to deposit the secret with him, and that Glass, following in pursuit, had surprised and murdered the both of them. The exact catena of the 2 crimes mattered less to me than the question, had Glass possessed himself of the secret before making off? At first I saw no room to doubt it, but your young friend's account of himself sent me to Falmouth, and at Falmouth I began to have my doubts. My earliest inquiries there were addressed to the pedagogue, the Reverend something or other Stimcoe, a drunken idiot who yielded no information at all, and to his wife, a lady who persisted in regarding me as sent from heaven for no other purpose than to discharge her small debts. From her, again, I learned nothing. But from a talk with one of her pupils, his name was Bates, if I remember, I discovered that Master Harry had been a particular crony of Coffin's, and this, of course, threw light on Coffin's visit to Minden Cottage. Still, there remained the question, had Glass managed to lay hands on the chart, or had it found its way, after all, into the possession of Master Harry Brooks? You'll excuse me, young sir, Dr. Beauregard turned to me, but during our talk in the garden, your manner suggested to me that you had a card up your sleeve. Well, whatever the answer, my obvious course was to return to Mortallone and await it, as for 15 years already I have been awaiting it, though question and answer but were now beginning to take definite form. Here you are then at last, and here am I. Tout vient à point, à qui c'est attendre. Then our arrival, sir, did not altogether surprise you, said Miss Belcher. On the contrary, ma'am, though for reasons you will not easily guess. It surprised me as I have never been surprised in all my life before. It confounded me, dumbfounded me, made chaos of my plans, and I am delighted to welcome you, ma'am. I desire to be allowed the honor of taking wine with you." "Willingly," assented Miss Belcher, holding out her glass to be replenished, "and the more so because I never drank better Rhone wine in my life." Dr. Beauregard stood up and bowed, his fine features overspread with a flush of pleased astonishment. "Madame," began Dr. Beauregard, and I have no doubt he had a compliment on his lips. But at that moment the hills and the amphitheatre of cliff behind us rang out and echoed with two terrible screams. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 31. Aaron Glass. The second scream followed the first, almost before we could lift our faces to the cliff. Dr. Beauregard had risen to his feet quickly, without fuss, and was unstrapping his gun. But Miss Belcher was quicker. A couple of muskets lay on the sand close beside the luncheon-cloth, and in a trice she had snatched up one of them and held our host covered. "You have deceived us, sir," she said quietly. Dr. Beauregard looked along the barrel and into her eyes with an admiring, half-quizzical smile. "Good," said he. "Good, but unnecessary. That the island is inhabited I supposed you to know, since Captain Branscome tells me he reported catching sight of smoke yesterday when off the western coast. But the fellows, there are or were 3 of them, by the way, are no friends of mine." "We have only your word for it," said Miss Belcher, without lowering her musket. "True, ma'am," the doctor assented, with a bow. "I am about to give you proof. But first of all oblige me by listening for another moment." He held up his hand, and while we all listened, I looked around from face to face. Captain Branscome had unslipped his gun, and stood eyeing the doctor with a puzzled frown. Plinny stared up at the cliffs. She was white to the lips, but the lips were firmly set, whereas Mr. Goodfellow's jaw hung as though loosed from its tacklings. So we waited for 20 seconds, maybe, but no third scream came down from the heights. "That makes 1 accounted for," said Dr. Beauregard. "I have known, first and last, 11 parties who hunted treasure on this island. They all quarrelled. They quarrelled, moreover, every one of them, before getting their stuff, such as it was, to the boats. Now, if you will permit me to say so, your own success, when you obtain it, will be a fluke, and an absurd fluke. It will stultify every rule of precaution, and violate every law of chance. I have studied this game for close upon 20 years, and reduced it almost to mathematics. And I foresee that you will play, nay, you have already played, 9 pins with my most certain conclusions. But you have, as gentlefolks, with all the disabilities of gentlefolks, the one thing that all these experts have fatally lacked. You have self-command." "It appears to me that we need it, at any rate," said Mrs. Belcher tartly, "if we are to be favoured just now with a lecture." Dr. Beauregard smiled. "The purport of my lecture, ma'am, was to prepare you for a question which I have to put. When these men arrive, Captain Branscome, Mr. Goodfellow and I must deal with them. Are you ladies prepared to exercise strong self-control? Will you, with Harry Brooks, await us here until our business is over?" "Excuse me, sir, but I must first know what your business is." "That, ma'am, will depend upon circumstances, but it is more than likely to be serious. I must trouble you now and always to speak to me definitely. If you propose to shoot these men, kindly say so." "I do not, ma'am, but their boat lies on the next beach, and as soon as they launch her they will discover us, and as soon as they discover us it will be life for life. But they need not discover us. In 5 minutes we can embark ourselves and our belongings. In less than 15 we can round the point to the southward, and beyond it lie 2 or 3 small coves where, as I judged in passing, a boat can lie reasonably safe from observation." "Admirably reasoned, ma'am. By all means take the boat. Take Harry Brooks with you, and Mr. Goodfellow for protection. But Captain Branscome and I must stay and see it out with these men." "For my part," put in Plinny, "I cannot see why these men have not as much right as we to the treasure, and in any case, if we let them go, they leave us a clear coast to hunt for the rest. Captain Branscome," Dr. Beauregard turned to him, "do these ladies, as a rule, assert a voice in your dispositions?" "They do, sir," answered the captain, with a tired smile, "and if you will take my advice, the only way with them is to make a clean breast of everything." "I will." The doctor faced about with a smile. "You must know then, ladies, that these 2 ruffians, for by this time there are 2 only, will presently be coming down to the next beach to launch their boat and leave the island. How do I know this? Because my study of treasure hunters has given me a kind of instinct, or because, if you prefer it, I have observed that the moment, the crucial moment, when these fellows quarrel is always the moment when, having laid hands on as much as they can carry, they turn to retreat. You doubt my diagnosis, ma'am?" he asked, turning to Miss Belcher. "Then I can convince you even more simply. These men are not camping here tonight. They will not return tomorrow to fetch a second load, and for the sufficient reason that there is no second load. I know the amount of treasure hidden where they have been searching. 2 men can lift and carry it easily." "How do you happen to know this?" asked Miss Belcher, eyeing him from under contracted brows. "For the excellent reason, ma'am, that I put the treasure there myself." The answer, staggering to the rest of us, seemed to brace her together. She had lowered her musket at the beginning of the discussion, but now, throwing up her head with a sharp jerk, she levelled her eyes on Dr. Beauregard's, as straight as though they looked along a gun barrel. "Then it can hardly be for the sake of the treasure, sir, that you propose to deal with these men." "It is not, ma'am." "Nor solely to protect us from them, since you have brought us here, where we need never have come." "No, ma'am. I brought you here because I cannot be in 2 places at once, and it was necessary to keep both parties under my eye. Having brought you, I am bound to protect you. But my main business here, and yours, or at any rate Captain Branscome's, is to punish." "To punish? But why to punish?" Dr. Beauregard hesitated, with a glance at Plinny and at me, who stood beside her. "A word in your ear, ma'am, if you will allow me." He stepped close to Miss Belcher, and spoke a sentence or 2 which I could not catch, but my eyes were on her face, and I saw it change colour. The next moment her square mouth shut like a trap. "If that be so, I wait for him along with you," she announced. "Oh, you may trust me, sir. I have a fairly strong stomach with criminals, and no sentiment." "It shall be as you please, ma'am, but for the others I would suggest their taking the boat and awaiting us around the point. See, the tide has risen, and within 5 minutes she will float. Mr. Goodfellow, will you accompany Miss Plinlimmon and the boy? Wait, please, until completely afloat before pushing off, for our friends must be near at hand by this time, and the grating of her keel might give them the alarm." "For the same reason, ma'am, unless you have any particular question to ask, we had best start at once, and when we have started, keep the strictest silence. Shall I lead the way?" They set off very cautiously, the doctor leading, Miss Belcher close at his heels. Captain Branscome a couple of paces behind her, gained the ridge, and passed out of sight around an angle of the rocks. Now, to be left in this fashion was not at all to my mind. It seemed to me that, when serious business was on hand, everyone conspired to treat me as a baby. I had told Captain Branscome yesterday that I would not put up with it, and though I stood in far greater awe of Dr. Beauregard than of the captain, I felt none the less mutinous now. Pliny, who in moments of agitation invariably had recourse to some familiar work for a sedative, was on her knees repacking the luncheon baskets. Her back was turned to me, and from her I glanced towards Mr. Goodfellow, who had stepped down to the boat, and was leaning over the gunwale to rearrange the gear. From him I looked up to the beach, to the ridge behind which the others had disappeared, and to the creepers overhanging the cliff. Suddenly it came into my head that by gaining the upper edge of the ridge, where it met the cliff, I could wriggle under these creepers and observe from behind them all that went on, as well on the next beach as on this, and with another glance at Pliny's back, I tiptoed away. I moved as swiftly as I dared, making no noise, nor looking behind me, until I reached the rocks under the cliff, the path by which Mr. Goodfellow had crept round to scuttle the boat. I calculated that by working my way along for 50 yards between them and the rock face, I should gain an opening which, observed from below, had seemed to promise me an excellent view of the next beach. But they hung so heavily that I found myself struggling in an almost impenetrable thicket, and when at length I gained the opening and drew breath above the splash of waves on the beach, I heard a sound which caused me to huddle back like a rabbit, surprised in the mouth of its burrow. Some 3 yards from my hiding, the bank of low cliff bounding the beach shelved upward and inland in a stretch of short turf, and from the head of this slope came the thud of footsteps, of heavy footsteps descending closer and closer. I drew back under the creepers and held my breath. Between their thick woven strands my eyes caught only, to the right, a twinkle of the sea, in front a yard or two of white shingle glittering beyond the green shade, and 5 seconds later this patch was blotted out as 2 men plunged past my spy-hole. They walked abreast and carried a box between them. I could hear them panting, so closely they passed. They halted on the edge of the bank. "The boat's all right," said one, and I heard him jump down upon the shingle. It seemed to me that I knew his voice. "Here, pass down the blamed thing." "Damn it all, man!" "I can't," whispered the other. "So help me, Bill, I can't. I'm not used to it, and I ain't got the nerve." "Nerve, and you call yourself a seaman, and a plucky lot you boasted the night we signed articles. Nerve, why you was the very man to find fault with him. Couldn't stand his temper another day, you said, and must do something desperate. Those were your very words." "I know it. I didn't think." "Oh, to hell with your didn't think. The man's dead, and cryin' won't bring him back. Much you'd welcome him if he did come back." "Don't, Bill." "Now look you here, Jim Lucky. Stand you up and help me get this lot in the boat, and the boat to sea. After that you can lie quiet and cry yourself sick. You'll be all right tomorrow, fit as a fiddle. I've been in this business before, and see how it takes men, even the strongest. It's the sight of blood, but the stomach gets accustomed. By this day week you'll be lively as a flea in a rug, and looking forward to driving in your carriage and pair. I promise you that. But what you've to do at this moment is to stand up and help me get down the boat, for if he's anywhere on this island, God help the pair of us." "He," quavered Jim Lucky. "I shouldn't wonder. But you told me he was dead." "Did I? Well, perhaps I did. That was to keep your spirits up. But now I don't mind tellin' you that I'm not sure. He ought to be dead by this time. But 'tis a question if the likes of him ever die. He's own cousin to the devil, I tell you, and if he's anywhere alive, like as not he's watching us at this moment." Whatever this meant, it appeared to rouse Jim Lucky and start him in a panic. I heard him sob as he helped to lower their burden upon the beach. All this time they had been standing immediately beneath me, and I dared not lift my head for a look. But now, as they went staggering down the beach, I parted the creepers and stared in their wake. They carried a heavy sea chest between them, but my eyes were neither for the chest nor for Jim Lucky, but for his companion, the man he called Bill. I knew him before I looked, and as I had recognized his voice, so now I recognized his narrow, foxy head and sloping shoulders. It was Aaron Glass. The two men carried the chest along at a rate that perhaps came easily enough to Jim Lucky, who was a young giant of a seaman, but was astonishing for a thin, windlestraw of a man such as Glass. He plowed his way across the sands like a demon, and had scarcely set down the chest, a little above the water's edge, before he was tugging at the boat. I heard him call to Lucky to help, and the pair heave-hoed together as they strained at the gunwale to lift her and run her down. From this ridge as yet came no sign. Presently from the boat they had pulled her down to the water, and were both stooping over her with their shoulders well inside, busy in arranging her bottom board. I heard a fearful oath, an oath that rose in a scream as the two men faced each other, scared, incredulous. "Scuttled, by God!" It was Glass who screamed it out, and with the sound of it a host of seabirds rose from the neighbouring rocks, whitening the sky. But Jim Lucky cast up both hands and ran. "Stop, you fool, stop!" I think the poor creature had no notion whither he ran, that he was merely demented. But in fact he headed straight for the ridge, not turning his head. Twice Glass called after him, then in a sudden fury whipped out a pistol and fired. For the moment I supposed that he had missed, for the man ran for another 6 strides without seeming to falter. Then his knees weakened, and he pitched forward on his face. I believe, on my word, that Glass had either fired in blind passion, or with intent to stop the man rather than to kill him. He stood and stared, and while the pistol yet smoked in his hand, I saw Dr. Beauregard step forth from his shelter, step delicately past the corpse, and raise his musket, and heard his clear, resonant voice call out, "Both hands up, Mr. Glass, if you please." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 32. Welcome to Dr. Beauregard's house. Glass's arm fell limp by his side, as though Dr. Beauregard had actually pulled the trigger and winged him. He turned half about as the pistol slid from his fingers. He gave no cry, only there reached us a loose, throttling sound, such as a steam whistle makes before fetching its note. It came to us in the lull between 2 waves that broke and raised up the sands to ripple round his feet. "Both hands up, Mr. Glass." Dr. Beauregard advanced a step, but instead of lifting his arms, the man curved them before him and held them so as if to protect his treasure, while he sank on his knees beside the box. His face was yellow with terror. "You fool!" The doctor, still holding him covered, advanced step by step to the box and bent over it, staring down at him. The rest of us, that is to say, Miss Belcher, Captain Branscome, and I, under I not know what compulsion, followed and came to a halt a few paces behind him. Standing so, I felt, rather than saw, that Pliny and Mr. Goodfellow, attracted by the report of the pistol, were peering at us over the ridge of rocks on the right. "You fool!" Dr. Beauregard repeated, and suddenly dropped the butt of his musket upon the loose cover of the chest. "You fool!" said he a third time, and tearing aside a splintered board, dipped his hand and held it up full of sparkling stones. Opening his fingers slowly, he let a few jewels rattle back upon the heap, and held out a moderate fistful towards the cowering Glass. "Did you actually suppose, having proved me once, that I would suffer such a common cut-throat as you to march off with my treasure? Look up at me, man. I charge you with having murdered Coffin, even as you have just murdered that other poor blockhead who trusted you." He nodded sideways, but still keeping his eyes upon Glass, towards the body which lay as it had fallen. "Answer me. Are you guilty? Yes or no?" The man's mouth worked, but his tongue crackled in his mouth like a parched leaf. "Yes, I know what you would say, that you had some excuse, that Coffin in his time had stuck at nothing to be quit of you, that he sold you to the press gang, that through Coffin you spent 8, 10, how many years, in the war prisons, that he believed you dead, as he had taken pains to kill you. Well, we'll grant it. As between two scoundrels, I'll not trouble to weigh the rights against the wrongs. But look at this boy here. You recognize him, hey? I charge you with having murdered his father, Major Brooks, as you murdered Coffin. You have run up a pretty long account, my friend, for so clumsy a performer, but I think you have reached the end of it." Aaron Glass looked at me and blinked. Terror of the man confronting him had twisted his dumb mouth into a kind of grin horrible to see. It lifted his lip like the snarl of a dog over his yellow teeth. Dr. Beauregard laughed softly. "And all for what? For an imperfect chart, and for these." He thrust his hand close up to Glass's face and spread his fingers wide, letting the gems drip between them and rain back into the treasure chest. "What's wrong with them? That's what you'd be asking, eh? If your poor tongue could find the words. Well, only this, my friend. Yes, look well at them, that I hid them myself, and every one of them is false." False? I could see Glass's mouth at work, his lips forming to the echo of the word as it struck across his terror like a whip. But he achieved no articulate sound. "I give you my word," resumed Dr. Beauregard. But a thud interrupted him. Glass had fallen forward in a faint, striking his forehead against the edge of the chest, and lay face downward, with the blood oozing from his temple and discoloring the sand. As the doctor paused and bent over him, another wave came rippling up the beach, throwing a long, thin curve of foam before it, and washed out the stain. Is he dead?" I heard Plinny's voice quavering. "Not yet, ma'am," answered the doctor grimly, and taking the inanimate body by the collar, he drew it above reach of the waves and turned it over. "You are a doctor, sir?" "Yes, ma'am, and have some small skill." He put up a hand to his breast pocket, half withdrew it, and hesitated. "You have balked me of a pretty little scheme," he said quietly. And still, while he addressed us, he seemed to be considering. "Think of this fellow's face when he got his treasure across to the mainland and attempted to trade it. To be sure, he gave us some fun for our pains." "If you call it fun, sir," protested Plinny. "Well, yes, ma'am," he answered quietly, kneeling and lifting Glass's head and resting it across his thigh. "My humor may be of a primitive sort, but I confess it tickled by shocking a murderer into a fainting fit." He felt in his breast pocket and drew forth a small phial. "No, sir," he turned to Captain Branscome, who had stepped forward to offer his help. "Let me alone, please. I prefer to treat my patient in my own way. It will be best, on the whole, for everybody." He forced Glass's mouth wide open, and with one hand poured about half of the contents of the phial between the patient's teeth, drop by drop, very patiently, with the other smoothing the gullet between finger and thumb. We all stood watching while he administered the dose, Miss Belcher close beside me, with her hand on my shoulder. At the 20th drop or so, I felt her give a start, as though a thought had suddenly occurred to her, and I looked up into her face. Her eyes were fixed inquiringly on Dr. Beauregard, and he, happening also to look up, met them with a smile. "You will see in a moment," he said, as if answering her thought, and, reaching forward, he laid 2 fingers on Glass's pulse. "Yes, in a moment now." Sure enough, in a moment Glass's eyelids fluttered a little, and he came back to life, with an audible catch of the breath. "In 2 minutes' time, sir," the doctor turned to Captain Branscome, "I shall be glad of your services, and of Mr. Goodfellow's, to carry the fellow down to the boat. That is to say, if, in deference to the ladies, you have really decided not to leave him here to his fate. He will sleep after this. Nay, if you will listen, he is sleeping already. The other man is dead, I suppose." "He must have died instantly," answered Captain Branscome, who had stepped across to the body to assure himself. "I had no doubt of it, by the way he dropped. Well, there is no need to fetch a spade. Their thoughtfulness provided one. You will find it in the boat there." Half an hour later we embarked, leaving behind us on the beach a scuttled boat, a mound of sand, and a chest of false jewelry, over the top of which the rising tide had already begun to lap. Aaron Glass lay along the bottom boards, asleep and breathing apoplectically. I pulled the stroke paddle, Mr. Goodfellow the bow, and the captain steered. Dr. Beauregard addressed himself to the ladies, of whom Miss Belcher sat with a corrugated brow, as though turning a thought over and over in her mind, and Pliny with scared eyes staring into vacancy. "I am sorry indeed, ladies," said the doctor, "that I could not have spared you this. The fool shot his mate, you saw it yourselves, without rhyme or reason. Against madness, and the impulses of madness, no man can calculate. I might plead, too, that in an undertaking like this you match yourselves against forces with which it is not given to ladies to cope. I grant admiringly the courage that brought you across thousands of miles to Mortallone, as I grant, and again admiringly, the steadiness of your behavior this afternoon. But one thing you did not know, that in the nature of things you were bound to meet with such men and see such things done. I have not lived beside treasure all these years without learning that it attracts such men as carrion attracts the vultures. Hide it where you will, from the end of the earth some bird of prey will spy it out, or at least some scent of it will lie and draw such prowlers as this fellow." Dr. Beauregard touched the sleeping man contemptuously with the toe of his boot. "I myself have been, shall we say, fortunate. I have emptied or assisted to empty 2 caches of treasure in this island. A 3rd remains, of which you have the secret, and I believe it to be the richest of all. But before you attempt it, I have a mind to tell you something of the other 2, that at least you may not attempt it unwarned." "You may spare yourself the pains, sir," said Miss Belcher decisively, "since our minds are made up. You might, I doubt not, succeed in frightening us, but since you will not deter us, I suggest that the less we hear the better." The doctor bowed. "Ah, madame," sighed he, "if only fate had timed your adventure 2 years ago, or if, departing with the treasure, you could even now leave me to regrets, in peace." "My good sir," said Miss Belcher sharply, "I haven't a doubt you mean something or other, but what precisely it is I cannot conceive." "You will go, madame, leaving my island twice empty. That is fate, and I consent with fate. But the devil of it is, ma'am, if I may use the expression, your removing the treasure will not prevent others coming to look for it, and annoying an old age which has ceased to set store on wealth, or on anything that wealth can purchase." She looked at him oddly. "Well, now," she confessed, "you are a mystery to me in half a dozen ways, but if on top of all you mean to turn pious—" He laughed, and when the laugh was done, it seemed to prolong itself inside him for fully half a minute. "You are right, ma'am. Let us be practical again, and as the first practical question, let me ask you, or Captain Branscome, what you propose to do with this man. Obviously we cannot take him along with us after the treasure." "Well, I imagine we are returning to the schooner. He can be left on board, in charge of Mr. Rogers." "But I was about to suggest that we take Mr. Rogers along with us. In some ways he is the most active of the party, and we can hardly spare him." "Of Goodfellow, then, or whomsoever Captain Branscome may appoint to take charge of the ship." The doctor sat silent, as though busy with a thought that had suddenly occurred to him. After a minute he lifted his head and threw a quick glance upward at the sky. "The breeze is freshening again, Captain," he announced. "If you care to hoist sail, the rowers can take a rest, at least until we reach Cape Fea." Captain Branscome gave permission to hoist sail, and soon we were running homeward with as much as we could carry. There was no danger, however, for beyond the northern point of Try Again Inlet the water lay smooth all along the shore. Dr. Beauregard here called on Plinny to admire the scenery, and borrowing her sketch-book and pencil, dashed off a bold drawing of Cape Fea as, rounding a little to the westward, we caught sight of it standing out boldly against the afternoon sun. As he drew it, he guided the talk gently back to ordinary topics, to England and English scenery, to the charm of English domestic architecture, and particularly of our great country seats, to gardens and gardening, of which he professed himself a devotee. "Ah," he sighed at length, drawing a long breath, "if you, my friends, only knew how much of what is happiest in life you carry in your own breasts. I used, forgive me, to laugh at such pleasures as I am enjoying at this moment. I see that nothing but gaiety and a simple heart can bring a man peace at the last, and now it is too late to begin." Plinny, not understanding in the least, opened wide eyes upon him. His tone seemed to ask for her pity. "Yes, yes, I have sought hard for pleasure, and grudged no price for it, but the stuff I bought was all flash and sham, like this fool's diamonds, flash and sham, and the end of it weariness. Well, there is money left. You shall take it, and endow a hospital if you choose, and that no doubt will increase your happiness, and make it thrive. But the root of the plant lies within you. Pardon me, ma'am," he looked towards Miss Belcher, "the question sounds an impudent one, I know, but are you not, even for England, a well-to-do lady?" "I have a trifle more than my neighbours," owned Miss Belcher, "but it's almost more plague than blessing. At least I call it so, sometimes, which is a different thing from being ready to give it up." "And you, ma'am?" He turned to Plinny. "I have enough for my needs, I thank God," she answered, "but I have known what it is to be poor." "Quite so," he nodded, "and yet you have come thousands of miles, you two, in search of treasure." At the entrance of Gow's Gulf we downed sail and took to our paddles again. The tide helped us against the breeze, and within half an hour we came in sight of the schooner lying peacefully at anchor as we had left her. So at least, and at first glance, it seemed. But as we drew near, Captain Branscome stood up suddenly, the tiller lines in his hands. "Hullo! Where's the dinghy?" It was gone, and, what was worse, our repeated hails fetched no answering hail from the ship. But just as we were beginning to feel seriously alarmed, a voice shouted from the opposite shore, and Mr. Rogers came sculling out from the shadow of the woods, working the dinghy towards us with a single paddle overstern. "Sorry, Captain," he hailed. "2 deserters in 2 days. Oh, we're a cheerful team to drive. but I have my excuse ready. The fact is," here catching sight of Dr. Beauregard, Mr. Rogers stopped short. "I fancy," said the doctor, amiably, turning to Captain Branscome, "your friend has not his excuse so ready as he supposed. Doubtless he'll impart it to you later on. Meanwhile, I would suggest that we take him along with us." "But where are we going?" asked Captain Branscome. "To my house. Ah, it is news to you that I have one? You supposed, perhaps, that the Lord Proprietor of Mortallone roosted at night in the trees? But where, in that case, would he stack his wine? My dear sir, I have a house and cellarage, to the both of which you shall be made welcome. Even if you decline my hospitality, we have the invalid here to dispose of, and surely you won't condemn a man of my years to carry him home pick-a-back." "But the schooner—" "I give you my word of honour, sir, that your ship shall not be visited nor tampered with in any way. Return when you will, you shall find her precisely as she lies now. In another 2 hours even this faint breeze will have died down, as you are seaman enough to know. The anchorage is landlocked, the bottom is perfect holding, and as for unwelcome visitors, there can be none. I am the sole resident on this island." I looked up at Dr. Beauregard sharply, and so, it seemed to me, did Mr. Rogers, who had fallen alongside. "That is to say," continued the doctor, quietly, without regarding either of us, "the only male resident." "All the same, I don't like it," persisted the captain, and shook his head, at the same time lifting his eyes towards Miss Belcher. "And it's clear against my rule." "Stuff and nonsense!" said Miss Belcher. "We ought to be grateful to Dr. Beauregard for taking this creature Glass off our hands. I was thinking a moment ago that for £1,000 I'd rather he was anywhere than on board our ship. The least we can do is to bear a hand with him, and if we don't like the house we can come away." "And before nightfall, if you insist," added Dr. Beauregard genially. "But the afternoon is young, and between now and nightfall you may all have made your fortunes. Who knows?" Captain Branscome yielded, after a look at Plinny, who backed up Miss Belcher, declaring herself ardent for new adventures. I began to see that the captain was wax in the hands of these two, and it puzzled me, who had some experience of him both in school and on shipboard. Instead, then, of heading for the ship, we rowed past her and up the creek, Mr. Rogers following in his dinghy, and disembarked at the landing place under the green knoll, while Dr. Beauregard and Mr. Goodfellow lifted out Aaron Glass, and while the captain explained to Mr. Rogers where and how we came by such a passenger, I stared about me, wondering where the doctor's house might be, and where the approach to it. For I remembered the narrow gorge leading up to the waterfalls, and the thick, precipitous woods on either hand, and how such a party as ours, including 2 ladies and a sick man, could hope to penetrate these woods or climb those waterfalls was a puzzle. In 10 minutes Mr. Goodfellow had patched up a fairly serviceable litter with the boat's sail and a couple of paddles. Dr. Beauregard bestowed the patient in it carefully enough, and when all was ready led the way. The 2 carriers, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Goodfellow, came next with the litter between them, and at a nod from the former I fell in beside him. The captain and the 2 ladies brought up the rear. "Harry," whispered Mr. Rogers, as we wound our way round the knoll, "is this really the man who—" "This is Aaron Glass," I said. He stared down, for he carried the hinder end of the litter upon the villainous, unconscious face. "He looks a pretty bad one," said Mr. Rogers after a pause. "You should have seen him on the beach," said I. "I've seen something myself," said he. "Closer, boy. There was a woman came down to the shore just now, waving to the ship and crying. At first I took her for a child. She was dressed all in white muslin and ribbons, you know, the sort of rig you see at a children's party. But when I rowed over close to her, "I know her," I said. "I met her in the woods yesterday." "That explains. Though I call it an infernal shame you didn't tell. I rode across to find out what ailed her. She stood waving her arms so and crying, like a child in distress. When I came near, she called on me to stop. 'Not you,' she said. 'The little boy. Where is the little boy?' I told her that we had a boy on board, but that just now you were off on a cruise, and with that she turned right about and ran up through the woods and out of sight, but for some way I could hear her crying and calling out just as before. 'The little boy,' it was. 'Where is the little boy?' Meaning you, I suppose." We were now come to the foot of the first waterfall, an obvious cul-de-sac for a party which included 2 ladies and a sick man on a litter. I stood gazing up at the wet, slippery rocks by which I had made my ascent yesterday, and searching in vain for a more practicable path. Dr. Beauregard halted and turned upon me with a smile. "A moment," said he, "and you will grant that my privacy is rather neatly protected. But first," he pointed to the water pouring past us from the pool beneath the fall. "You may remark that the stream here has more than twice the volume of the stream you see coming down the rocks." I looked. The difference was plain enough, and I had been a fool in failing to observe it. "The reason being," he went on, "that a second and larger stream flows into the pool under the very stones on which you are standing. I myself laid that channel for it almost 10 years ago, and nature has very kindly helped to disguise it. Now, if you will follow me." He drew aside a mat of creepers overhanging a bush to the left of the path, and, stooping, disappeared into a dim, green tunnel, so artfully contrived that even without its curtain of creepers it suggested no more than a chance gap in the undergrowth. The tunnel zigzagged twice at a sharp angle, and then, quite suddenly, the dimness changed to warm sunlight, and we emerged at his heels upon a prospect that well excused my gasp of astonishment. We stood at the lower end of a smooth, green glade, through which a broad stream, a river almost, came swirling, its murmur drowned in the thunder of the waterfall behind us, which the bushes now concealed. The glade was, in fact, a valley bottom, thinned of undergrowth and set with tall trees, and the stream such a stream as tumbles through many an English deer park. The whole scene might have been transplanted from England, but for a wall of naked cliff, sharply serrated, which enclosed the valley on the left, and under it, like a smooth military terrace at the foot of a fortress, the glade curved upward and out of sight. The scene, I have said, was almost typically English, but to the eye only. "Faugh!" exclaimed Miss Belcher, looking about her and sniffing suspiciously. "A pretty place enough, but full of malaria, or I'm a Dutchwoman. And what a horrible silence." "Malaria," said Mr. Rogers quietly. "There's better scent than malaria in this valley, and we're hot on it. Here's the river, and what does the chart say, boy? 5 trees, a mile and a half from the creek head. We must have come a mile already. Keep your eyes skinned, and give me a nudge if you see such a clump." But there was no need to keep my eyes skinned. At the next bend of the glade, he and I caught sight of it simultaneously. A clump of noble pines that would have challenged notice even had we not been searching for them. My heart stood still as I counted them. Yes, there were 5. "I haven't often wanted to put a knife into a man's back," grunted Mr. Rogers, with a gloomy glance ahead at Dr. Beauregard. For an instant I made sure the doctor had overheard him. He halted suddenly and turned to us with a proprietary wave of the hand towards the trees. "A fine group, sirs, is it not? I have often regretted that the cliff yonder just cuts off the view of it from my windows. Indeed, I had almost altered the site of the house to include it. But health before everything, hey, ladies? There is always a certain amount of fever in these valleys, and you will own, presently, that the sight I prepared has its compensations." He resumed his way past the trees, and, a quarter of a mile beyond them, past an angle of the cliff where the ridge bent sharply back from the river and revealed a narrow gorge, its entrance choked with pines, running up towards the mountain. Here he paused again, and with another wave of the hand. High on the right of the gorge, on a plateau above the dark pine tops, a white painted house looked down on us, a long, low house with a generous spread of shadow under its veranda, and a dazzle of light where the upper windows took the sun. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 33. We Find the Treasure. "I've a strong sense of the right of property," said Miss Belcher, sipping her tea. We had gathered in Dr. Beauregard's deep veranda at the corner where it took the late afternoon sunshine. The level rays sparkled on the silver and delicate Worcester china of the doctor's tea equipage, and fell through the open French window into the doctor's drawing-room. A wonderful room it was, as everything in the house was wonderful, a spacious, airy room, furnished in white and gold, with Dresden figures on the mantel-shelf, Venetian mirrors, dainty watercolors sunk into the panels, cases of rare books, among them, as I remember, a set of the Cabinet des Fées, bound in rose-colored morocco and stamped with the royal arms of France, stands of music, and a priceless harpsichord inlaid with ivory. Next to the airiness of the house, which stood high above reach of the valley mists with their malaria, what most sharply impressed me, and the ladies in particular, was its exquisite cleanliness. Yet Dr. Beauregard assured us that he kept but one servant, the negress Rosa. At her master's call she had appeared in the veranda above us as we mounted the last terrace towards the house, and had stood there watching our ascent with no trace of surprise, or indeed of any emotion whatever, on her black, inscrutable face. Her eyes met mine as though she had never seen me before. To her care Dr. Beauregard had given over the still unconscious Glass, and, with a sign to Mr. Rogers and Mr. Goodfellow to follow her with their burden, she had led the way through the house to the bedroom at the back. There, in a bed between spotlessly clean sheets, they had laid the patient, and been dismissed by her. It was she who, less than 10 minutes later, had brought our tea to us in the veranda, and with our tea many little plates heaped with small cakes and sweetmeats, all fresh, as though she had been expecting us for hours, and could command the resources of a city. I kept a sharp lookout, but of the strange lady, the lady of the graveyard, I could detect no trace. Nothing indicated her presence, unless it were the dainty feminine furniture of the drawing-room. "I've a strong sense of the right of property," said Miss Belcher, sipping her tea and touching the oilskin wrapper, which lay in her lap unopened, as Dr. Branscombe had handed it to her. "And so has Jack Rogers here. You tell me, sir, that you hold Mortallone by grant, and doubtless you can show your title." "Willingly, madame." Dr. Beauregard rose and stepped to the French window. "You can read Spanish?" he asked, turning there and pausing. "Not a word," answered Miss Belcher. The doctor smiled. "It would impart nothing if you could," said he, with a smile, "for I will own to you frankly that Mortallone has always been under suspicion of containing treasure, and in the grant all treasure trove is expressly reserved. I cannot say," he added, smiling again, "that I have strictly observed the clause, but as between you and me, it legally disposes of my claim." "Thank you," said Miss Belcher, "but I don't own an equally tender conscience towards governments." Here Mr. Rogers winked at me, for as a patron of smugglers Miss Belcher enjoyed some reputation, even for a Cornish landowner. "We will leave government out of the question, but as proprietor, lord of the manor, as we should say at home, you have a right to your share, and that, by English law, which I suggest we follow, is 1/3. Dr. Beauregard bowed. "I'm infinitely obliged to you, ma'am, and I make no doubt that what you so generously promise you will as honourably give, when I claim it. In truth, I have something more than enough for my needs. There was a time, I will confess, when I had sold my soul, if I possessed such a thing, for a glimpse of what lies written on that parchment. But I am old, and old age—" He broke off the sentence and did not resume it, but went on presently with a change of tone. "However, I still keep a sporting interest in the treasure, which has baffled me all these years, the more so because I have a shrewd suspicion that it has lain all the while within a mile or so of where we sit at this moment." "It does, sir," said Miss Belcher, unfolding the chart and pointing. Dr. Beauregard adjusted a pair of gold-rimmed eyeglasses and bent towards it. The writing was indistinct, and he put out a hand as if to take hold of the edge of the parchment and steady it. The hand, I noticed, did not tremble at all. "Stay a moment, sir." Miss Belcher turned the chart over. "The clue is given here, upon the back. Listen," and she translated. 8 bank of river a mile and a half up from Gow Creek. Center tree in clump of 5. Branch bearing north and half a point east. 2 forks." "My trees!" exclaimed the doctor. "You remember my halting and pointing them out to you." "Ah, yes, and I, too, remember now that you appeared to be disconcerted. You recognized them, of course." "Yes, we recognized them," Miss Belcher admitted. "But let me finish. Right fork, 4 feet. Red cave under hill, 475 yards from foot of tree, north-northwest. The stones here under rock 4 spans, left side. Which means, I suppose, that the cave lies some way up the face of the rock, and can only be seen by climbing out upon the right fork of the tree, and that the stones, that is to say the jewels, are hidden under a rock to the left, which rock either measures 4 spans or lies 4 spans within the entrance of the cave." "I know of no such cave, ma'am," said Dr. Beauregard, bending his brows, "though, to be sure, the cliff is of a reddish colour thereabouts, due to a drip of water and the growth of some small fungus." "I was a fool," said Captain Branscome, "to leave the tools in the gig. If we go back to fetch them, sunset will be upon us before we get to work." The doctor rose with a smile. "You might have guessed, sir, that I am not unprovided with spades and picks, or with ropes and a ladder, which also I foresee we shall need. Come, if you have drunk your tea, I will ask you to follow me into the house, the ladies included, and choose your outfit." They went in after him. I was in the act of following. I had, in fact, taken a couple of steps towards the French window, when a slight shiver seemed to run through my hair, and I stood still. "Little boy!" The words came in a whisper from the end of the veranda. I stole back, and leaning well across the rail, peering around the corner of the house. "Little boy!" whispered the voice again, and I saw the little lady of the graveyard. She was standing close back against the sideboarding, her body almost flattened against it. "Come," she whispered, beckoning with a timid glance over her shoulder towards the rear of the house. I looked at her for a second or two and shook my head. "But you must come," she insisted, still in a whisper, and took a step or two as if to entice me after her. Then she halted, and, seeing that I made no motion to follow, came tiptoeing back. "If you do not come," she said, "he will kill you. He will sartainly kill you all." She nodded vehemently, and so, after another glance to right and left, beckoned to me once again. Her face was white, almost as her muslin frock, and something in it persuaded me to climb over the veranda rail and follow her. About 50 yards from the corner of the house stood a clump of odorous laurels, the scent of which we had been inhaling while we sat at tea. For these she broke away at a run, nor looked back until she was well within their shadow and I had overtaken her. "Good boy," she said, nodding again and smiling at me with her desperately anxious face. I would very much wish, to kiss you. But you must not come anear," she sighed. "It is not healthy. Only you come with me. I dream of you sometimes, all last night. What a pity, I dream, and you so pe-ritty, boy. Now you come with me, and I take you away, so he never find you." The woman was evidently mad. "Please tell me what you have to say," I urged, "and let me go back. They will be missing me in a minute or so." "If they miss you, it is no matter now. He will kill them all. He is so strong, as he killed all those others, you remember. See now, pe-ritty boy, what I have done for you, to save you from him. He shut me up, in his other house. He has another house away up in the woods, beyond where we met." She waved a hand toward the hills. "But I break out and come here to save you. He would kill me also if he knew." Mad though I believed her, I was growing pretty thoroughly frightened, remembering the graveyard under the trees. "You forget my friends," said I, speaking very simply, as to a child. "If he means to kill them, I ought to carry them warning." "He will not kill them till tonight," she answered, shaking her head. "It is always at night time, when they are at supper. There is no hurry, little boy, but he will sartainly kill them all the same." I turned my head, preparing to run, for I heard Captain Branscome's voice in the veranda, calling my name. "They are starting after the treasure. I must go," I stammered. She drew close and laid a hand on my arm. Again a dreadful odour was wafted under my nostrils, an odour as of tuberoses, and I know not what of corruption. And, as before in the graveyard, it turned me both sick and giddy. "They will not find it," she said, nodding with an air of childish triumph. "Shall I tell you why? I have hidden it." Here she fell back on her old litany. "He would kill me if he knew. I hid it, years ago. But come, and I will show you. And you shall take a great deal, yes, as much as you can carry, if only you will go away and never be rash again." A second time I heard Captain Branscome's voice calling to me, demanding to know where I had disappeared. She put a finger to her lips, smiling. "Such treasure you never did see. Even Rosa does not know. Come, little boy." She pushed her way through the laurels, and I followed her. The edge of the shrubbery overhung the dry bed of a torrent, in the cleft of which, when we had lowered ourselves over the edge, we were completely hidden from the house. From the edge a slope of loose stones ran down to the bottom of the cleft, where a thin stream of water trickled. The stones slid with me, but not dangerously, and as we scurried down, I in my thick boots, she in her diminutive dancing shoes, I heard Plinny's voice join with Captain Branscome's in calling my name. But by this time I was committed to the adventure, and by they desisted, supposing, as Pliny told me later, that I had taken French leave again, and run off to be the first at the clump of trees. We might not climb the slope directly in face of us, for, by so doing, even if it had been accessible, which I doubt, we should have emerged into view. We therefore bent our way to the right, up the bottom of the gorge, to a narrow tongue of rock dividing it, in the shelter of which we mounted the rough stairway of the torrent bed from one flat rock to another, until we stepped out upon a shallow plateau, where the contour of the hills shut off the house and its terraces. We stood, as I judged, upon the reverse or northern side of that ridge, which to the south and west overlooked the valley of the treasure. Above the plateau a stone-strewn scarp of earth led to the forest, which reached to the very summit of the ridge. And towards the summit, after pausing for a second or two to pant and catch her breath, my strange guide continued her climb. "What is your name, little boy?" I told her, and she repeated it once or twice to get it by heart. "You may call me Meta," she said. "He calls me Meta always, when he is pleased with me. And that is almost every day. He is kind to me. Oh, yes, very kind, though terrible, of course. Keep on my left hand, Harry Brooks, so the breeze here will not blow from me to you." I drew up in a kind of giddiness, for that dreadful scent of death had touched me again. She, too, halted with a little cry of dismay, and a feeble motion of the hands, as if to wring them. "Ah, you must keep wide of me. That is my suffering, Harry Brooks. I cannot bend over a flower but it withers, and the butterflies die if they come near my breath, and that, too, is his doing. He would be kind to me, he said, and would inoculate me, yes, that is his word, inoculate me, so that no poison could ever harm me. He knows the secrets of all the plants, and why people die of disease. Months at a time he used to leave me alone with Rosa, and go to Havana, to the hospitals, and there he would study till his body was wasted away with work. But at the end he would come back, bringing visitors. Oh, many visitors, for he was rich, and the house had room for all. There were singers, he loves music, and men who played all day at cards, and women who made me jealous. But he would only laugh and say, "Wait, little one." So I waited, and in the end they all died. Rosa said it was the yellow fever. But no. She held up both hands, and made pretense to pour something from an imaginary bottle into an imaginary glass. He can kill with one tiny drop. In his study he keeps a machine which makes water into ice. Rosa would carry round the ice with little glasses of curacoa after the coffee was served, and all would say, "What wonders are these? Ice in Mortallone?" and would drink his health. But he never touched the ice. You tell that to your friends, little boy, but it will not save them, for he will find some other way. As we went up the woods, these awful confidences poured from her like childish prattle, interrupted only by little ripples of laughter, half shy, half silly, and altogether horrible to hear. I hung back, divided between the impulse to tear myself away and the fearful fascination of listening, between the urgent need to find and warn my friends, and the forlorn hope to extract from her something that might save them. The toil of the climb had bathed me in sweat, and yet I shivered. I halted. We were close under the summit of the ridge, and had reached a passing clearing where, between the trees, as I turned about, I could see the whole gorge in shadow at my feet, the sunlight warm on its upper eastern slopes, and beyond these the sea. In half an hour, in 20 minutes maybe, I might reach the valley there below, and at least cry my warning. I faced round again to my companion. She had vanished. My mouth grew dry of a sudden. Was she a ghost? And her prattling talk, the voice yet singing in my brain. "Little boy, little boy." I parted the tall ferns. Beyond them a small hand beckoned, and following it, I came face to face with a wall of naked rock, from which she lifted aside the creepers over a deep cleft, a cleft wide enough to admit a man's body if he turned sideways and stooped a little. She clapped her hands at my astonishment. "You like my bower?" she asked gleefully. "Ah, but wait, and I will show you wonders. No one knows of it, not even Rosa." She wiggled her way through the cleft. I peered in and went after her cautiously, expecting, as the curtain of creepers fell behind me, to find myself in a dark cave or grotto. Dark it was, to be sure, but not utterly dark, and to my amazement, as my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, the faint light came from ahead of me and seemed to strike upwards from the bowels of the earth. Do not be afraid, little boy, but hold your head low, and look to your feet now, for it is steep hereabouts. Steep indeed it was, a kind of shaft, floored for the most part with slippery earth, but here and there with an irregular stairway of rock, and still at the lower end of the tunnel shone a faint light. I would have given worlds by this time to retrace my steps. A slight draught blowing up the tunnel from my companion to me bore the odour of death upwards under my nostrils, but this, while it dizzied and sickened me, seemed to clog my feet, and take away all will to escape. I had nearly swooned, indeed, when my feet encountered level earth again, and she put out a hand to steady me. Is this the end? It goes down, down, little boy, but we need not follow it. See, there is light. To the left of you, light, and fresh air, and my pretty bower. I turned as her hand guided me. A puff of wind blew on my cheek, cold and infinitely pure. I stood blinking in a short gallery that ended suddenly in blue sky, and staggering forward, I cast myself down on the brink. It was as though I lay on the sill of a great open window. Below me, far below, waved great masses of forest, and beyond these, far beyond, shone the blue sea. I cannot say to what depth the cliff fell away below me. It was more than sheer, it was undercut. I lay as one suspended over the void. But see, pretty boy, did I not promise you wonders? As I faced around to the darkness of the gallery, she held aloft something which, for the moment, I mistook for a great green snake, with lines of fire running from scale to scale, and sparkling as she waved it before me. I rolled over upon my elbow and stared. It was a rope of emeralds. She flung an end over one shoulder and looped it low over her breast. Then, passing the other end about her neck, she brought it forward over the same shoulder and let it dangle. It reached almost to her feet. "Does it become me, little boy?" She made me a mock curtsy that set the gems dancing with fire. "Come and choose, then." She put out both hands to the darkness by the wall, and a whole cascade of jewels came sliding down and poured themselves with a rush about her feet and across the floor of the gallery. She laughed and thrust her hands again into the heap. "All these I found, I myself, and carried up here from the darkness. Take what you will, little boy, and run back to your ship. Is it diamonds you will choose, or rubies, or, see here, this chain of pearls? I do not like pearls for my part. They mean sorrow. But see here again. There were boxes and boxes, all heaped to the brim, and long robes sewn all over with pearls. Take what you like. He will not know. He gives me diamonds sometimes. I adored them in the old days in opera. And he remembers, and gives me a stone from time to time, to keep me amused. I laugh to myself then when I think of the store I keep here in my bower. And he so clever, but he does not guess. Ah, child, if I had had but these to wear when I used to sing Eurydice." She held out 2 handfuls of diamonds and began to sing in a high, cracked voice, while she let them rain through her fingers. "But listen," I cried suddenly. She ceased at once and stood with her face half turned to the darkness behind her, her arms rigid at her sides, the gems dropping as her hand slowly unclasped them. Below, where the tunnel ran down into the darkness, a voice hailed, "Meta! Is that Meta?" It was the voice of Dr. Beauregard. The poor creature gazed at me helplessly and ran for the stairway. But her feet sank in the loose heap of jewels. She stumbled, and as she picked herself up, I saw that she was too late, for already a light shone up from the tunnel below, and before she could gain the exit, the doctor stood there, lifting a torch, in the light of which I saw Mr. Rogers close behind his shoulder. "Meta!" I do not think he would have hurt her, but as the torch flared in her face and lit up the shining heap of jewels, she threw up both hands and doubled back, screaming. I believed that she called me to hide. I put out a hand to catch her by the skirt, seeing that she ran madly, but the thin muslin tore in my clutch. "Meta!" On the ledge, against the sky, the voice seemed to overtake and steady her for a second, but too late. With a choking cry, she put out both hands against the void and toppled forward, and in the entrance was nothing but the blue, empty sky. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Chapter 34. Dr. Beauregard. Glass? My dear Madame, pardon my remissness. He is dead. Rosa brought me the news before we sat down to table. I opened my eyes. In the words, as I came back to consciousness, I found nothing remarkable, nor for a few seconds did it surprise me that the dark gallery had changed into a panelled, lighted room, with candles shining on a long white table, and on flowers and crystal decanters, and dishes heaped with fruit. The candles were shaded, and from the sofa where I lay, I saw across the cloth the faces of Miss Belcher and Captain Branscome intent on the doctor. He was leaning forward from the head of the table and speaking to Pliny, who sat with her back to me, darkly silhouetted against the light. Mr. Rogers, on Pliny's left, had turned his chair sideways and was listening too, and at the lower end of the board a tall epergue of silver partially hid the form of Mr. Goodfellow. "Yes, indeed, I ought to have told you," went on the doctor's voice, "but really no recovery could be expected. The man's heart was utterly diseased." His gaze, travelling past Pliny, wandered as if casually towards me, where I lay in the penumbra. I felt it coming, and closed my eyes, and on the instant my brain cleared. Yes, Glass was dead, of course, poisoned by this man, as ruthlessly as these my friends would be poisoned if I cried out no warning. Or perhaps it had already happened. I opened my eyes again, cautiously, little by little. The doctor was filling Pliny's glass. Having filled it, he pushed the decanters towards Mr. Rogers, and turned to say a word to Miss Belcher on his right. No, there was time. It had not happened yet. I wanted to start up and scream aloud, but some power stronger than my will held me down against the sofa cushion. I had lost all grip of myself, of my voice and limbs alike. I could neither stir nor speak, but lay watching with half-closed eyes, while the room swam, and in my ears I heard a thin voice buzzing. "Tell your friends. The ice. He never touches the ice, but it will not save them. He will find some other way." The door opened, and its opening broke the spell. On the threshold stood the tall negress with a tray of coffee cups, and on the tray a salver with a number of little glasses, and a glass bowl, a bowl of ice. Her master pushed back the decanters to make room for the tray before him. She set it down, and the little glasses jingled softly. "Upon my word, sir," said Miss Belcher, "what wonder upon wonders is this? Ice, and in Mort alone? It is Rosa's little surprise, madame, and she will be gratified by your—" He pushed back his chair, and, leaving the sentence unfinished, rose swiftly and came to me as I staggered up from the sofa. A cry worked in my throat, but before I could utter it, His 2 hands were on my shoulders, and he had appealed to the company with a triumphant little laugh. Did I not tell you the child would come to himself all right? A simple sedative, after the fright he had. He's trembling now, poor boy. No, ma'am. He turned to Pliny, who had risen and was coming forward solicitously. Let him sit upright for a moment while he comes to his bearings, or, better still, when you have finished your coffee, if Miss Belcher will be kind enough to pour it out for me, we will take him out into the fresh air. Yes, yes, and the sooner the better, for I see that Mr. Rogers is fidgeting to be out and assure himself that the treasure has not taken wings. He forced me gently back to my seat and walked to the table. What were we saying? Ah, yes, to be sure, about the ice. He lifted his coffee cup with a steady hand, and his eyes traveling over it fixed themselves on me, as though to make sure I was recovering. The ice is a surprise of Rosa's, and I assure you she is proud of it. But you may go, Rosa. I advise you to content yourself with wondering, for the water on these hills, strange to say, is not healthy. They voted the doctor's advice to be good, and having finished their coffee, wandered out into the fresh air. Pliny took my arm, and leading me to the veranda, found me a comfortable seat, where I could recline and compose myself, for I was trembling yet. They have stacked the treasure there beyond the last window, Pliny informed me, nodding towards the end of the veranda, where Captain Branscome, Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Goodfellow were already gathered and busy in conversation. In bulk, it is less than we expected, but in value, the doctor says, it goes beyond everything. 300 weight, they say, and in pure gems. He is to choose his share by and by, and then we have to contrive how to take it down to the ship. Miss Plinlimmon, said the captain, coming towards us, you promised me a word yesterday. I should wish to claim it now. That is, if Harry can spare you. I observed that his voice shook a little, but this I set down to excitement. Did I? Yes, I remember. Miss Plinlimmon's voice, too, was tremulous. She hesitated, and her eyes in the dim light seemed to seek mine. I assured her that I was recovering fast, here in the fresh air, and that it would be a kindness indeed to leave me alone. She bent quickly and kissed me. I wondered why, as she stepped past the captain, and he followed her down the veranda steps. I wished to be left alone. I was puzzled, and what puzzled me was that neither Miss Belcher nor Dr. Beauregard had left the dining-room. In fact, as I passed out, through the window, happening to turn my head, I had caught sight of his face, and it had signalled to her to stay. I knew not why he should intend harm to Miss Belcher rather than to any other of our party, but I distrusted the man, and Pliny had scarcely left me before, having made sure that Mr. Rogers and Mr. Goodfellow were within easy call, I rose up softly, crept to the dining-room window, and dropping upon hands and knees close by the wall, peered into the room. The doctor and Miss Belcher had reseated themselves. He had poured himself out another glass of wine, and was holding it up to the light with a steady hand, while she watched him, her elbows on the table, and her firm jaw resting on her clasped fingers. Her face, though it showed no sign of fear, was pallid. Yes, he was saying slowly, it is too late at this hour to be discussing what the priests would call the sin of it. You would never convince me, and if you convinced me, I am too old and too weary for what the priests call repentance. I am Martin, the same man that outwitted Melhuish and his crew, the same that played Harry with this glass, and the man Coffin, and a drunken old ruffian they brought with them from Whydah. The fools, to think to frighten me, that had started by laying out a whole ship's crew. And now you come along, and I hold you all in the hollow of my palm. But I open my hand, so, and let you go. Why? Why? I have told you, I am tired. That is not all the truth, answered Miss Belcher. eyeing him steadily. "No, it is not all the truth. No one tells all the truth in this world. But I am glad you challenge me, for you shall have a little more of the truth. I let you go because you were simpletons, and I had not dealt with simpletons before." "Is that the truth?" she persisted. He laughed and sipped his wine. "No, I let you go because I saw in you, I who have killed many for wealth, and more for the mere pleasure of power, something which told me that, after all, I had missed the secret. From an outcast child in Havana, I had made myself the sole king of this treasure of Mortallone. I went back and made slaves of men and women who had tossed that child their coppers in contemptuous pity. I brought them here to Mortallone to play with them, and as soon as they tired me, they went. It was power I wanted. Power I achieved, and in power, as I thought, lay the secret. The tools in this world say that a poisoner is always a coward. It is one of the phrases with which fools cheat themselves. For long I was sure of myself, and then when the thought began to haunt me that, after all, I had missed the secret, I sought out the man who, in Europe, had made himself more powerful than kings, and I found that he had missed the secret too. Then I guessed that the secret is beyond a man's power to achieve, unless it be innate in him, that the gods themselves cannot help a man born in bastardy, as I was, or born with a vulgar soul, as was Napoleon. One chance of redemption he has, to mate with a woman who has, and has known from birth, the secret which he has missed. I guessed it, I that had wasted my days with singing, women such as poor Meta. Then I met you, and I knew. Yes, madame, you, whose life tonight I had almost taken with a touch, taught me that I had left women out of account. Ah, madame, if the world were 20 years younger! Will you do me the honor to touch glasses and drink with me?" "Not on any account," said Miss Belcher, rising, "not to put too fine a point upon it. You make me feel thoroughly sick." But she hesitated on the threshold of the window. "The worst of it is, I think, I understand you a little." I drew back into the shadow. Her stiff skirt almost struck me on the cheek as she passed, and crossing the veranda, leant with both hands on the rail, while her face went up to the sky and the newly risen moon. A voice spoke to her from the moonlit terrace below. "Hello," she answered. "Is that Captain Branscome?" "It is, ma'am, and Miss Plinlimmon, Amelia, as she allows me to call her." Miss Belcher cut him short with a laugh. It rang out frank and free enough, and only I, crouching by the wall, understood the hysterical springs of it. "You two geese!" she exclaimed, and ran down the steps to them. "Was that Lydia?" demanded Mr. Rogers a moment later, as he came along the veranda. "It was," I answered. "I don't understand these people," grumbled Mr. Rogers, pausing and scratching his head. "There was to have been a meeting outside here, directly after supper, to divide off Dr. Beauregard's share, but confound it if every one doesn't seem to be playing hide-and-seek. Where's the doctor?" "In the dining-room," said I, nodding towards the window. He stepped towards it. At that moment I heard a dull thud within the room, and Mr. Rogers, his foot already on the threshold, drew back with a cry. I ran to his elbow. On the floor, stretched at her master's feet, lay the negress Rosa. Dr. Beauregard stood by the corner of the table and poured himself a small glass of curacoa. While we gazed at him, he reached out a hand to the ice bowl, selected a small piece, and dropped it delicately into the glass. I heard it tingle against the rim. "Your good health, sirs," said Dr. Beauregard. He sat back rigid in his chair. End of chapter 34. End of Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch.